At 37,000 feet, Claire Morgan made a fatal mistake. She judged the wrong man. The oil-stained engineer she dismissed in business class was the only thing standing between 300 souls and an alpine grave. When both engines died and the cockpit went silent, when screams filled the cabin and the mountains rose to meet them, the quiet man with the scarred hand stood up. Daniel Ross had walked away from the sky once before, after a mission that saved lives but destroyed his own. Now the sky was calling him back, and this time everyone was watching. If you're ready to witness how one dismissed hero brought a dying plane home, stay until the end. Hit that like button and comment your city below so I can see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The Geneva airport hummed with the efficient chaos of international travel, a symphony of rolling luggage, multilingual announcements, and the perpetual scent of coffee and jet fuel. Claire Morgan moved through it like she owned the very air around her, heels clicking against polished marble, designer coat draped over one arm, phone pressed to her ear as she confirmed tomorrow's board meeting in Milan. At 42, she had built Morgan Technologies from a garage startup into a billion-dollar empire. Forbes called her visionary. Business Insider called her ruthless. Both were right. She had learned early that the world didn't reward kindness. It rewarded results, precision, and the ability to make hard decisions without flinching. Sentiment was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when every quarter demanded growth. Every decision affected thousands of jobs. Every moment of weakness could be exploited by competitors circling like sharks. "Tell Marcus the numbers better be perfect," she said into her phone, navigating toward the business class lounge. "I don't care if he worked all night. Perfect, or he's out." She ended the call without waiting for a response. Marcus would deliver, or he wouldn't. Either way, she'd handle it. The lounge was everything she expected. Leather chairs, subdued lighting, complimentary champagne that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Claire settled into a corner with her laptop, fingers already flying across the keyboard. The Milan presentation needed refinement. The projected growth curves weren't aggressive enough. Conservative estimates were for people afraid of their own ambitions. "Ms. Morgan," a young attendant approached with practiced deference. "Your flight to Milan begins boarding in 20 minutes. Gate 17. "I'll be there," Claire said without looking up. The attendant retreated. Smart girl. She'd learned quickly not to linger when Claire Morgan was working. By the time Claire gathered her things and made her way to the gate, a small crowd had already formed. She cut through the priority boarding lane, barely registering the envious glances from the main queue. This was her normal. First in line, first to board, first to everything that mattered. The flight attendant at the gate smiled with professional warmth. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Morgan. Business class, seat 2A. Claire stepped onto the aircraft, immediately cataloging her surroundings with the same analytical precision she applied to quarterly earnings reports. The plane was a standard wide body, configured for transcontinental routes. Business class occupied the front 16 seats, arranged in a 2-2 configuration with enough space for actual work. Good. She'd need every minute of this flight. She moved down the aisle toward her seat, already planning her work schedule for the next 90 minutes. Review the presentation, respond to the 18 emails that had come in during the 30-minute drive to the airport, prepare her opening remarks for the board meeting. Then she saw him. A man sat in seat 2B, her row, window seat, and everything about him set her teeth on edge. He wore dark work pants and a plain gray shirt that had seen better days. His hands, resting on the armrests, bore the unmistakable stains of manual labor, oil, grease, the permanent discoloration that came from working with machinery. His face was weathered, quiet, unremarkable except for the deep fatigue in his eyes and a scar that traced from his left eyebrow down to his cheekbone. He didn't belong here. Not in business class, not on a flight filled with executives and consultants, not in Claire's carefully ordered world. She stowed her bag in the overhead compartment with more force than necessary, letting her displeasure show in every movement. The man glanced up briefly, registered her presence, then returned his attention to the window. He didn't speak, didn't smile, didn't offer any of the small social gestures that business travelers typically exchanged. Good, Claire thought. At least he knew enough to stay quiet. She settled into her seat, pulling out her laptop with deliberate efficiency. The man shifted slightly to give her more room, pressing himself closer to the window. The gesture irritated her more than it should have. She didn't need his consideration. She needed him to not be there at all. A flight attendant appeared, Gabrielle, according to her name tag, with a tray of pre-flight beverages. "Champagne, Ms. Morgan?" "Please." Claire accepted the glass, noting with satisfaction that Gabrielle had recognized her name from the manifest. Good service meant attention to detail. Gabrielle turned to the man. "Sir, may I offer you—" "Water's fine," he said quietly. His voice carried a gravelly quality, like he didn't use it often. American accent, somewhere from the Mountain West. Colorado, maybe? Or Montana? Gabrielle brought him water in a plastic cup while Claire sipped Dom Perignon from crystal. The visual metaphor wasn't lost on her. This was exactly how the world should work. Everyone in their proper place, proper class, proper station. More passengers filed in, filling the business class cabin with the usual suspects. A silver-haired executive in an Italian suit took 1A, immediately pulling out his phone for one last call. Two women in their 30s, likely consultants based on their matching laptops and serious expressions, settled into row 3. A couple in their 60s, holding hands with the comfortable intimacy of long marriage, took row 4. All of them belonged. All of them had earned their seats through success, achievement, the natural hierarchy of merit and money. All except the man with oil-stained hands. Claire tried to focus on her laptop, pulling up the Milan presentation. Slide 3 needed work. The market analysis was too conservative, didn't account for the aggressive expansion she had planned. She began typing notes, her fingers moving with practiced speed. The plane lurched slightly as it pushed back from the gate. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their route to Milan. Flight time of approximately 90 minutes. Current weather conditions over the Alps. Clear skies, minimal turbulence expected. Routine. Perfect. Exactly what Claire needed for a productive flight. The man beside her shifted in his seat, and Claire caught a better look at his hands. They weren't just stained, they were marked with dozens of small scars, the kind that came from years of working with sharp edges and hot metal. Mechanic's hands, or maybe factory work. Either way, definitely not the hands of someone who should be sitting in business class. She couldn't help herself. "Upgrade?" she asked, her tone making it clear she already knew the answer. He turned to her, and for a moment she saw something flicker in his eyes. Not anger, not even offense, just a kind of tired recognition, like he'd heard variations of this question 1,000 times before. "Something like that," he said simply. The vagueness of his answer irritated her. She wasn't making conversation, she was confirming what they both knew. He didn't belong here, and they both understood it. "Well," Claire said, returning to her laptop. "Lucky you." She meant it to end the conversation, a polite dismissal that left no room for further discussion, but she felt him watching her for a long moment before he turned back to the window. The plane taxied toward the runway, joining the queue of departing aircraft. Through the window, Claire could see the Alps in the distance, their peaks dusted with early snow, sharp and magnificent against the late afternoon sky. Beautiful, in an impersonal way. She appreciated beauty when it didn't interfere with productivity. The engine spooled up, that distinctive whine that preceded takeoff. Claire had flown enough to find the sound almost comforting, the mechanical promise of departure, the physics of lift and thrust carrying her toward her next conquest. The plane accelerated down the runway, pressing her back into the seat. The nose lifted. The ground fell away. Geneva became a sprawl of buildings and roads, then a map, then a memory. Claire opened her email, already moving on to the next task. 18 unread messages. She'd clear them before they reached cruising altitude. The seatbelt sign dinged off. Around the cabin, passengers relaxed, reaching for books and tablets and headphones. The man beside her didn't move. He just sat there, hands resting on the armrests, eyes fixed on something beyond the window. The Alps, maybe, or nothing at all. Claire tried to ignore him, but something about his stillness bothered her. Most people filled silence with movement, fidgeting, checking phones, adjusting seats. He sat like a statue, barely breathing. His posture rigidly controlled in a way that seemed almost military. "Stop it," she told herself. "He's not your concern. Focus on the work." She pulled up the market analysis spreadsheet, losing herself in numbers that made sense. projections that followed logic, growth curves that obeyed the rules of supply and demand. This was her language, her comfort zone. Here, everything had an answer. Every problem had a solution. Every challenge could be overcome with enough intelligence and determination. 20 minutes into the flight, Gabrielle returned with meal service. "Miss Morgan, we have pan-seared salmon or herb-crusted chicken this evening. Salmon, please, dressing on the side." Claire didn't look up from her laptop. "And for you, sir?" The man glanced at the meal cart, and Claire caught something in his expression. A brief tightness around his eyes, gone so quickly she almost missed it. "I'm fine, thank you." "Are you certain? The salmon is excellent." "I'm sure." "Thank you." His voice remained quiet, but firm enough that Gabrielle didn't push. Claire watched the exchange from her peripheral vision, her analyst's mind cataloging details. He'd refused the meal not because he wasn't hungry, she'd caught that momentary hunger in his eyes, but for some other reason. Pride, maybe, or discomfort with the formality of business-class service. Gabrielle set Claire's meal on her tray table. Salmon perfectly seared, asparagus arranged with artistic precision, a small salad with dressing in a separate container exactly as requested. The kind of meal that cost more than the man beside her probably made in a day. Claire ate mechanically, tasting nothing, her attention split between the food and her laptop. The market analysis still bothered her. The numbers were solid, but they lacked the aggressive edge that had built her empire. Conservative projections were for people afraid of failure. Beside her, the man shifted slightly. She glanced over, catching him looking at something on his phone. A photo, it seemed, though he angled it away too quickly for her to see details. But she'd caught the expression on his face in that brief moment. Grief. Raw and unguarded, there and gone in a heartbeat. Claire looked away, uncomfortable with the intimacy of witnessing something so private. Other people's pain wasn't her concern. She had enough challenges managing her own life without taking on the emotional burdens of strangers. She finished her meal and went back to work, determined to complete the presentation revisions before landing. The Alps passed beneath them, their peaks catching the late afternoon sun, casting long shadows across valleys that had witnessed centuries of human struggle and triumph. Claire barely noticed. 45 minutes into the flight, the plane hit a rough patch. Not unusual over the Alps, the mountains created their own weather systems, pockets of turbulence that could rattle even experienced travelers. The seatbelt sign dinged on. Gabrielle and the other flight attendants moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, securing loose items and checking that passengers had fastened their belts. Claire saved her work and closed her laptop, settling back in her seat. The turbulence wasn't severe, just annoying, the kind of bumpy air that made typing impossible but didn't merit real concern. Beside her, the man's posture had changed. The rigid control had intensified, his hands gripping the armrests with white-knuckled force. His breathing had shifted too, slow, measured, like he was counting each breath. His eyes were closed, and a muscle twitched in his jaw. Fear, Claire realized. He was afraid of flying. The observation came with a small surge of contempt. A grown man, afraid of routine turbulence. She'd crossed the Atlantic in storms that had sent meal carts flying down the aisles, had landed in crosswinds that tilted the plane at terrifying angles. You didn't build a billion-dollar company by letting fear dictate your actions. The turbulence subsided after a few minutes. The seatbelt sign stayed on, but the ride smoothed out, returning to the gentle vibration of normal flight. The man's grip on the armrest slowly relaxed. His breathing evened out. Then Claire noticed his left forearm, exposed where his sleeve had ridden up during the turbulence. A scar ran from his wrist to his elbow, thick, raised, the kind of scar that came from serious trauma. Burns, maybe, or shrapnel. The kind of injury that spoke of violence, of moments when everything went wrong. Her analytical mind, trained to spot patterns and connections, began assembling pieces. The military posture, the controlled breathing during turbulence, the scars on his hands and face and arms, the deep fatigue in his eyes, the grief she'd glimpsed when he looked at his phone. This wasn't just some mechanic who'd lucked into a business-class seat. This was someone with a story, probably one he spent his life trying to forget. Claire found herself curious despite her better judgment. She'd built her career on reading people, on understanding what motivated them, what they wanted, what they feared. This man was a puzzle, and she'd always been terrible at leaving puzzles unsolved. That's quite a scar, she said, nodding toward his arm. He glanced down, seeing what she'd noticed. For a moment she thought he wouldn't respond. Then he pulled his sleeve down, covering the scar with a deliberate motion. "Old accident," he said. The two words were delivered with such finality that they were clearly meant to end the conversation. But Claire had never been good at accepting dismissal. "Must have been some accident." He turned to look at her fully for the first time since the flight began. His eyes, gray, she noticed, like winter clouds, carried a weight that had nothing to do with the scar on his arm. "It was," he said quietly. "Long time ago." Something in his voice made Claire's next question die unspoken. This wasn't the evasiveness of someone hiding embarrassment or shame. This was the locked door of someone protecting wounds that had never fully healed. She should have left it alone, should have returned to her laptop, to her spreadsheets and projections, and the comfortable world of numbers that always made sense. But something, curiosity, boredom, or maybe just the perverse instinct that made her push when wisdom suggested retreat, kept her engaged. "What do you do?" she asked. "For work?" "Aircraft maintenance," he said. "Ground crew. Inspections, repairs, that kind of thing." So she'd been right, mechanic's hands. The oil stains made sense now. "That's why you were nervous during the turbulence? You know too much about what can go wrong?" A ghost of something, not quite a smile but close, crossed his face. "Something like that." "Do you fly often?" "Not if I can help it." "But you work on planes." "Working on them is different from riding in them." Claire filed that away, adding it to her growing profile of this strange, quiet man. He understood aircraft, understood them well enough that it made him wary of flying. That spoke to genuine expertise, not just routine mechanical knowledge. "You didn't fear what you didn't understand." "So what brings you to Milan?" she asked. "Job." "Just passing through, heading home after that." "Home being?" He hesitated, and Claire saw him weighing how much to share, deciding what questions he could answer and which ones required too much explanation. "Montana, small town. You wouldn't know it." "Try me." "Whitewood. Population 4,200. One main street, 3 churches, a diner that makes the best pie you've ever had." His voice softened slightly, the first hint of warmth she'd heard from him. "It's not much, but it's quiet, peaceful." Claire tried to imagine choosing quiet and peaceful over opportunity and growth. Failed completely. Sounds boring. Sounds perfect to some people. But not to you? He looked at her with those winter gray eyes, and she saw something shift in his expression. Recognition, maybe, of a kindred spirit. Someone else who ran from something. "I used to think different. Used to think the world was bigger than one small town. That I needed to be part of something important." He paused. "Turned out I was wrong about what mattered." Before Claire could respond, the plane lurched. Not the gentle bump of routine turbulence, a sharp, violent movement that sent her laptop sliding across the tray table. She grabbed it instinctively, saving it from crashing to the floor. The seatbelt sign, already on, began to chime insistently. Gabrielle's voice came over the intercom, professional, but with an edge of concern. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some unexpected turbulence. Please ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened and remain seated until the captain turns off the seatbelt sign." Another lurch, harder this time. Somewhere behind them, someone gasped. A woman's voice, high and frightened. Claire's hands tightened on her laptop. This was more than routine mountain turbulence. The plane was moving in ways that felt wrong. Sudden drops, sharp tilts, corrections that seemed too aggressive. Beside her, the man's entire demeanor had changed. The fear she'd noticed earlier was gone, replaced by intense focus. He was listening, not just hearing, but listening with the concentration of someone who understood the language the aircraft was speaking through its movements and sounds. The plane dropped suddenly, a stomach-lurching fall that lasted 2, 3, 4 seconds before the wings caught air again. Several passengers cried out. Someone behind them was praying in rapid Italian. "That's not normal," Claire said, hating the tremor in her voice. "No," the man agreed quietly. "It's not." His calmness steadied her more than any reassurance could have. Whatever was happening, he understood it in ways she didn't. And he wasn't panicking. The captain's voice cut through the cabin, professional but strained. Folks, we're experiencing some technical difficulties. Nothing to be alarmed about, but we're going to need to divert to the nearest airport as a precaution. Please remain calm and keep your seatbelts fastened. Technical difficulties. The phrase was designed to be reassuring, but Claire's analytical mind translated it instantly. Something was wrong with the plane. Wrong enough that the captain was breaking off the route, looking for the nearest place to land. Another violent movement, this time a roll that tilted the cabin at an angle that sent Claire's stomach sideways. Her laptop fell despite her grip, clattering to the floor. Beside her, the man's hands were back on the armrests, but now his focus was absolute, his head tilted slightly as if listening to sounds no one else could hear. The cabin lights flickered. Jesus, someone behind them whispered. The plane shuddered, a deep mechanical vibration that felt fundamentally wrong. Claire had flown enough to know the normal sounds and movements of an aircraft. This wasn't normal. This was the machine struggling, fighting something it wasn't designed to overcome. She looked out the window, seeing the Alps below, beautiful and deadly. Their peaks close enough to make out individual ridges and valleys. Too close, her instincts screamed. They were too low, descending too fast. We're dropping altitude, she said, not really talking to anyone, just voicing the observation her mind was screaming. Yes, the man beside her confirmed. His voice remained calm, but she heard something underneath it now. Not fear, calculation, assessment. The voice of someone evaluating a situation with professional detachment. Why? Engine failure. Maybe both. Hard to tell from here. The casual way he said it, like he was discussing the weather, not their potential death, jolted her. How do you know that? He turned to her, and for the first time she saw past the quiet, tired exterior to something else underneath. Authority. Competence. The bearing of someone who'd commanded more than just wrenches and inspection reports. Because I've flown enough to recognize the sound of an engine dying, he said simply. Before Claire could process that statement, Gabrielle appeared at the front of the business class cabin. Her professional composure was cracking, fear visible in the tightness around her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the seat backs. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, and her voice shook. We need you to... The plane dropped again, harder this time. Gabrielle stumbled, catching herself against a seat. Someone screamed. The emergency oxygen mask dropped from the overhead compartments, yellow cups swinging like pendulums. Claire stared at her mask, hanging there like a surreal joke. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not on a routine flight from Geneva to Milan. Not on a clear afternoon with minimal turbulence forecast. Not to her. She'd built her entire life on control, on managing variables, on ensuring outcomes through preparation and intelligence and relentless execution. But control required systems that functioned, rules that held, a world that responded to effort and planning. 37,000 feet above the Alps, control was an illusion. The only thing between her and the mountain peaks below was metal and machinery and physics, and at least one of those was failing catastrophically. The man beside her reached for his oxygen mask with practiced efficiency, pulling it over his face and securing the straps with movements that spoke of muscle memory. He'd done this before, not in a safety demonstration, but in reality when the masks meant the difference between consciousness and passing out. Claire fumbled with her own mask, her hands suddenly clumsy. He noticed, reached over, and helped her secure it without a word. His touch was impersonal but gentle, the gesture of someone who'd helped scared people before. Through the clear plastic of the oxygen mask, she watched him. His eyes were scanning the cabin, taking in details. The angle of descent, the behavior of the other passengers, the way Gabrielle was moving toward the cockpit with urgent purpose. He was reading the situation like she read quarterly reports, extracting meaning from data most people wouldn't notice. The plane's descent steepened. Through the window, the mountains were getting closer, their details becoming clearer: snow, rock, the dark shadows of valleys. Beautiful and terrible, magnificent and utterly indifferent to the 300 people falling toward them. Claire's mind, usually so quick with analysis and solutions, could only repeat one thought. This is really happening. We're going to crash. Then Gabrielle's voice cut through the chaos, high and desperate, carrying from the front of the cabin where she'd grabbed the intercom handset. Is anyone on this aircraft a pilot? We need any passenger with flight experience to identify themselves immediately. The question hung in the air like the oxygen masks, absurd and terrifying. Claire looked around the business class cabin, executives, consultants, the elderly couple still gripping each other's hands. No one moved. No one spoke. No one except the quiet man with oil-stained hands and scars that told stories he'd never share. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up, steadying himself against the tilting floor with the balance of someone who'd learned to move in aircraft that were dying in the sky. "I can fly," Daniel Ross said quietly, and everything Claire Morgan thought she knew about judgment and worth and who belonged where shattered like glass against the mountains rushing up to meet them. Gabrielle's eyes locked onto Daniel with a mixture of desperate hope and professional assessment. She moved toward him through the tilting cabin, gripping seat backs for balance as the plane continued its sickening descent. "Sir, I need to verify, do you have actual flight experience? This is not the time for—" "10 years military," Daniel said, his voice cutting through her question with quiet authority. "Fighter jets, combat missions, I know what I'm doing." The words landed like stones in still water. Around the business class cabin, passengers who'd been too focused on their own terror suddenly looked up, registering this new development. The quiet man with dirty hands was a pilot, had been a pilot. The distinction felt crucial in that moment. Claire stared at him, her mind reeling. Fighter jets, combat missions, 10 years. She'd dismissed him as a mechanic, someone who worked with his hands in the grimy underbelly of aviation. She'd been so catastrophically wrong that the irony would have been funny if they weren't plummeting toward the Alps. "How long since you've flown?" Gabrielle asked, already motioning him toward the cockpit even as she posed the question. Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. 7 years. 7 years. Claire watched the number register on Gabrielle's face. The calculation of whether a pilot who hadn't flown in 7 years was better than no pilot at all. The answer came quickly. Anything was better than the alternative. "Come with me," Gabrielle said. "Now." Daniel moved past Claire without looking at her, his movements precise despite the plane's erratic motion. She caught his arm without thinking, her hand closing on the scarred forearm she'd noticed earlier. "Wait," she said through her oxygen mask, not sure what she wanted to say, only knowing that watching him walk away felt like watching their last chance disappear into the unknown. He looked down at her hand, then up at her face. For a moment, something passed between them. Not forgiveness for her earlier dismissal, but acknowledgement. She'd judged him. He'd accepted that judgment with the weariness of someone who'd been underestimated so many times it no longer hurt. And now both of them understood that none of it mattered, that status and class and who belonged where were concepts that dissolved at altitude when engines failed. "It's okay," he said quietly. "I've got this." Then he was gone, following Gabrielle toward the cockpit, leaving Claire gripping an empty armrest and wondering if those would be the last words she'd ever hear him speak. The elderly couple in row 4 were praying now, their voices audible even over the sounds of the struggling aircraft. The consultants in row 3 had their arms around each other, tears streaming down their faces. The silver-haired executive in 1A sat perfectly still, his Italian suit impeccable, his eyes closed as if refusing to witness whatever came next. Claire pulled off her oxygen mask, the cabin pressure had stabilized enough that she could breathe without it, and realized her hands were shaking. She, who had stared down hostile boardrooms and cutthroat competitors, who had made decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars without flinching, was shaking like a terrified child. The cockpit door opened briefly, and through it she caught a glimpse of chaos. Flashing lights, the co-pilot slumped forward in his harness, the captain's face pale and strained as he struggled with controls that weren't responding. Then Daniel disappeared inside and the door closed, sealing him away with whatever nightmare awaited. The minutes that followed were the longest of Claire's life. The plane continued to descend, the mountains growing closer with terrible inevitability. She could see details now, individual trees on the slopes, the white ribbon of a river cutting through a valley, the geometric patterns of a village that looked like a toy town from their altitude but represented real lives, real people going about their evening with no idea that death was falling toward them from the sky. She thought about her company, about the empire she'd built through sheer force of will and intelligence. She thought about the board meeting in Milan that would never happen, about Marcus and his perfect numbers, about all the emails in her inbox that would never be answered. She thought about her apartment in San Francisco, 3,000 square feet of carefully curated success that no one would ever visit because she'd been too busy building her career to build relationships. She thought about her parents, who died in a car accident when she was 25, right when Morgan Technologies was just getting started. She'd thrown herself into work after their death, using success as a shield against grief, building monuments of achievement on foundations of loss. They'd be proud, she thought, or disappointed. She'd never know now. Most of all, she thought about the man she'd dismissed an hour ago, the quiet stranger with oil-stained hands who was now somewhere beyond that closed cockpit door doing something she couldn't comprehend with skills he'd kept hidden beneath humility and silence. The intercom crackled to life and Daniel's voice filled the cabin. It had changed, no longer quiet or deferential, but carrying the unmistakable tone of command, of someone who'd spoken into headsets while making life or death decisions. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Daniel Ross. I'm a former military pilot, and I'm taking control of the aircraft. We've lost both engines due to what appears to be fuel contamination. The captain has been incapacitated by a medical emergency. I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. His calmness was surreal, almost offensive in its steadiness. How could anyone sound that composed while delivering news that they were flying a dead plane? We're approximately 15 minutes from the nearest suitable landing site, a regional airport in the valley below. I'm going to glide us there. This aircraft is fully capable of gliding without engine power, and I've done this before, but I need absolute cooperation from everyone on board. Claire found herself leaning toward the speaker, hanging on every word. Around her, other passengers were doing the same, their terror momentarily suspended by the authority in Daniel's voice. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for emergency landing. Passengers, when instructed, assume crash position. Head down, hands behind your head, feet flat on the floor. Stay in that position until we've come to a complete stop. If you have family members or friends in other parts of the aircraft, do not try to reach them. Stay in your seats. Trust your flight attendants. Trust me. The intercom clicked off. Gabrielle and the other attendants were already moving through the cabin with renewed purpose, no longer panicked but focused, channeling their fear into action. They demonstrated the crash position, secured loose items, ensured everyone's seatbelts were properly fastened. Claire watched them work, marveling at their composure. They were just as terrified as everyone else. She could see it in their faces. But Daniel's voice had given them something to hold on to. Command. Direction. The promise that someone who knew what they were doing was fighting for their lives. The plane's angle of descent changed subtly. Through the window, Claire saw the wing adjust, the flaps extending slightly. Someone was flying this aircraft, coaxing performance out of a machine that should have been falling like a stone. The movements were precise, controlled, nothing like the violent lurches and drops of earlier. She pulled out her phone, knowing it was probably futile but needing to try anyway. No signal. They were too low in the mountains, too far from cell towers. She opened her notes app instead and began typing, not sure why or for whom, only knowing that if these were her last minutes, she wanted to leave something behind. I was wrong about so much. Built an empire, but forgot to build a life. Judged people by their appearance instead of their character. The man trying to save us right now? I dismissed him as invisible an hour ago. If we survive this, I'll do better. Be better. I promise. She saved the note, locked her phone, and slid it into her pocket. Then she did something she hadn't done since her parents' funeral. She closed her eyes and tried to pray, fumbling for words she'd forgotten, reaching for faith she'd abandoned when the world had proven too harsh for sentiment and hope. The intercom crackled again. 90 seconds to touchdown, Daniel's voice announced. Flight attendants, be seated. Passengers, crash positions now. Claire bent forward, assuming the position Gabrielle had demonstrated. Head down, hands clasped behind her neck, feet flat. Around her, 300 people did the same, their prayers and tears and ragged breathing creating a chorus of terror and desperate hope. Through the gap between the seats in front of her, she could see the ground rushing up. They were so low now that she could make out individual buildings, cars on roads, a soccer field with tiny figures running across it. Normal life, continuing in blissful ignorance, while a crippled aircraft approached carrying its cargo of fear and fragile mortality. 60 seconds, Daniel said. His voice remained steady, but Claire caught something underneath it now. Not fear exactly, but intense concentration. Every ounce of his being focused on the impossible task of landing a plane with no engines, no power, only gravity and aerodynamics, and whatever skills he'd retained from a life he'd walked away from 7 years ago. The plane dropped lower. Claire felt the landing gear deploy, heard the mechanical grinding as hydraulic systems struggled to function without engine power. They were committed now. No going around, no second chances. Whatever happened in the next 60 seconds would determine whether 300 people lived or died. 30 seconds. Brace, brace, brace. The ground filled her vision. A runway. She could see it now, gray concrete stretching ahead. They were lined up, approaching from the correct angle. Daniel had done it, had guided this dying plane to exactly where it needed to be. 20 seconds. We're going to make it. Stay in crash position. Was that true, or was it the lie you told terrified passengers in their last moments? Claire couldn't tell, didn't want to know. She kept her head down, her hands locked, her eyes squeezed shut. The first impact came harder than she expected, wheels hitting concrete with a bone-jarring slam that sent shockwaves through the entire aircraft. Someone screamed, metal groaned. Claire's teeth rattled in her skull as the plane bounced, lifted, came down again. Then they were rolling, decelerating fast but controlled, the reverse thrusters that should have helped slow them absent because the engines were dead. Claire felt the plane's momentum fighting against friction and air resistance, physics and mathematics determining whether they'd stop before the runway ended. The aircraft veered slightly left, then corrected. More metal grinding sounds, something breaking or tearing. But they were slowing, definitely slowing, the world outside the windows no longer a blur but distinct shapes. Buildings, vehicles, people running. Slower. Slower. Then stillness. Complete, perfect stillness. The terrible sounds of descent and impact replaced by silence so profound it felt sacred. For 5 heartbeats, no one moved. No one spoke. 300 people sat frozen in crash position, afraid that moving might somehow restart the nightmare, might reveal that survival was an illusion. Then Daniel's voice, rough now with exhaustion, but carrying unmistakable triumph. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Sion Regional Airport. We're down, we're safe. Evacuation crews are approaching. Please remain seated until the flight attendants give instructions to deplane. The cabin erupted. People were crying, laughing, some still praying, others hugging strangers. The elderly couple in row 4 were kissing like teenagers. The consultants were sobbing in each other's arms. Even the silver-haired executive had tears streaming down his face. Claire straightened slowly, her entire body aching from tension and the violence of landing. Through the window, she saw emergency vehicles surrounding the aircraft, fire trucks, ambulances, airport security. She saw news helicopters hovering at a distance, already circling like vultures to feed on their story of near catastrophe and miraculous survival. She saw Daniel emerge from the cockpit. He looked 10 years older than when he'd entered it. His face was gray with exhaustion, his shirt soaked with sweat despite the cold. The scar on his face stood out in sharp relief against his pallor. His hands were shaking, not much, but enough that Claire noticed. Enough that she understood what it had cost him to maintain that steady voice, that unshakable calm. Gabrielle was behind him, tears streaming down her face. She threw her arms around him, and he stood there awkwardly, accepting the embrace with the discomfort of someone unused to gratitude or touch. "You saved us," Gabrielle was saying, her words tumbling out between sobs. "You saved everyone." The captain had a stroke. The co-pilot panicked. "We were going to die, and you just—" "I did what needed doing," Daniel said quietly, gently extricating himself from her embrace. "The captain, how is he?" "Alive. Unconscious but breathing. The paramedics are coming for him now." The forward door opened and emergency crews flooded in. Paramedics headed straight for the cockpit. Others began the process of evacuation, helping passengers gather their belongings and exit the aircraft, with the careful efficiency of professionals who understood that the danger wasn't over until everyone was safely off the plane. Claire stood on shaking legs, gathering her laptop and bag. Her hands were still trembling, her heart still racing. She'd faced down hostile takeovers and board rebellions without breaking a sweat, but 15 minutes of helplessness at 30,000 feet had reduced her to this, grateful for breath, for solid ground, for the continuation of existence she'd taken for granted. She moved toward the exit with the other passengers, shuffling forward in the slow procession of survival. Daniel had moved to the side, out of the main flow of people, letting others pass while he leaned against the bulkhead with his eyes closed. Claire stopped in front of him. He opened his eyes, focusing on her with visible effort. "I need to apologize," she said. "Not necessary." "Yes, it is. I judged you, dismissed you, made assumptions based on oil stains and wrinkled clothes. You were being human," Daniel interrupted. His voice was gentle, without accusation. "People judge. It's what they do. Don't worry about it." "How can you be so—" She struggled for the word. "Forgiving? Because I've done worse things than misjudge someone's clothes." He pushed off from the bulkhead, straightening with obvious effort. "We survived. That's what matters. Everything else is noise." But it wasn't noise to Claire. For the first time in years, maybe ever, she was confronting the reality of who she'd become, the person she'd built through ambition and ruthlessness and the belief that success justified everything. That person wouldn't have survived what they'd just been through. That person would have died screaming, helpless, alone. This man, who she deemed unworthy of business class, had saved her life and hadn't even wanted an apology for her contempt. "What you did up there," she said, gesturing toward the cockpit. "That was my job. Used to be my job, anyway. Why'd you stop? Flying, I mean. If you're that good." Something shuddered in his expression, a door slamming closed. Long story. Not for today. An emergency worker appeared at Claire's elbow. "Ma'am, we need to keep the evacuation moving. Please proceed to the exit." She wanted to argue, to stay, to understand this man who'd held 300 lives in his hands and set them down gently despite his own demons. But the worker was insistent, and other passengers were pressing forward, and Daniel had already turned away, moving toward where Gabrielle was gathering the flight crew. Claire let herself be guided to the exit, down the emergency stairs, onto solid ground that felt surreal after the terror of the last hour. Ambulances were taking the most shaken passengers for evaluation. Reporters were being held back by security, their cameras recording everything. Airport officials were setting up a staging area where passengers could be processed and arrangements made for continuing their journeys. She stood there in the Swiss twilight, still holding her laptop and bag, watching emergency workers swarm over the silent aircraft. It sat there on the runway like a wounded bird, having given everything it had to bring them home. Through the crowd, she caught glimpses of Daniel. Paramedics were trying to check him over, but he was waving them away, insisting he was fine. Airport officials wanted statements. Reporters were trying to get close enough for questions. He looked overwhelmed, cornered, desperate for escape from the attention he'd never sought. This was the price of heroism, Claire realized. Not the glory or recognition, but the exposure, the questions, the invasion of privacy that came when you did something extraordinary enough to warrant public interest. She'd courted that attention her whole life, understood how to manage it, how to use it. For Daniel, it looked like torture. She watched him finally break free from the crowd, heading toward the terminal building with his head down, his whole posture screaming his desire to disappear. No one tried to stop him. The authorities had what they needed, and the reporters had plenty of other passengers willing to describe their brush with death. Claire followed at a distance, her analyst's mind still cataloging details. He moved with purpose despite his exhaustion, navigating the terminal like someone who understood airports, who'd spent years in transit through anonymous spaces designed for temporary occupation. He found a quiet corner near a closed gate and sank into a chair, his head falling back against the wall. She approached slowly, giving him time to notice her, time to send her away if he chose. He opened his eyes when she was a few feet away, looked at her without surprise. "You don't give up, do you?" he said. "Not usually." She sat down in the chair beside him without waiting for invitation. "I wanted to, I don't even know. Thank you seems inadequate. You already apologized. We're good. We're not good, or I'm not good. I need to understand something." He sighed, a sound of pure weariness. "What?" Why'd you help? After the way I treated you, after I made it clear I thought you didn't belong, why step up? Why risk yourself for a plane full of strangers who probably thought the same thing I did? Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Around them, the terminal hummed with activity, delayed flights being rescheduled, confused travelers trying to understand what had happened, the machinery of modern aviation adapting to disruption. You want the truth? He finally said. Please. Because it wasn't about you or them. It was about doing what I knew how to do when no one else could. That's all. He paused, then continued, his voice dropping lower. And because I've already failed people who counted on me. I wasn't going to do it again. Not if I could help it. The pain in those words was naked, unguarded. Claire felt like she was witnessing something she had no right to see, standing on ground too sacred for casual observation. The scar, she said quietly. The mission you mentioned. What happened? His jaw tightened. I told you. Old accident, long time ago. Bullshit. You don't walk away from 10 years of military flying because of an accident. You don't stop doing something you're that good at unless something breaks inside you. Maybe something did break. His eyes met hers, and she saw the weight behind them. Not just fatigue, but the accumulated burden of years carrying something too heavy to share. Maybe some things don't get fixed. You just learn to live around them. Is that why you're in Montana? Whitewood, population 4,200, hiding from whatever broke? I'm not hiding. I'm living. There's a difference. Is there? He stood abruptly, and for a moment she thought he'd walk away, end the conversation the way he'd ended every other attempt at connection. But he didn't leave. He just stood there, looking down at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. 7 years ago, he said finally, I led a mission that went wrong. We got the job done. Rescued hostages, completed the objective. But my wingman didn't make it home. He had a wife, 2 kids. They were 3 and 5. I had to stand in their living room and explain why their daddy wasn't coming back. Had to watch his wife's face when she understood that I'd made choices that saved strangers and cost her everything. Claire's throat tightened. The picture was forming now. The story behind the scars and the silence and the oil-stained hands working on aircraft instead of flying them. I tried to keep flying, Daniel continued, told myself it was just part of the job, that we all accepted the risks. But every time I strapped into a cockpit, I saw his face. Every time I pulled back on the stick, I thought about those kids growing up without a father. So I quit. Walked away. Found work that let me stay on the ground, stay invisible, stay away from situations where my decisions could get people killed. But today was different. Today, staying invisible meant 300 people dying. So I stepped up. Did what needed doing, and now I'm going home to Montana where I can go back to being nobody, and that's exactly what I want. He sat back down, the brief surge of energy that had powered his confession draining away. They sat in silence, 2 strangers bound by crisis and confession, neither quite sure what to do with the intimacy that trauma had forced upon them. Claire's phone buzzed in her pocket, shattering the silence between them. She pulled it out, seeing dozens of missed calls and messages flooding in now that they were back in cell tower range. Marcus, the board members, her assistant, news outlets somehow already having her contact information, the entire world she'd built demanding her attention, pulling her back toward the life she'd almost lost. She silenced the phone and put it away. You should answer that, Daniel said. People are probably worried. They can wait. The words surprised her even as she said them. Claire Morgan didn't make people wait, didn't prioritize strangers over business, didn't sit in airport terminals having conversations about grief and guilt when there were fires to put out and empires to maintain. But something had shifted in the 15 minutes between takeoff terror and runway impact. Something had cracked in the foundation of certainty she'd built her life upon. The kids, she said quietly. Your wingman's kids, do you still see them? Daniel's expression went carefully blank. No, his wife moved away, needed a fresh start somewhere that didn't remind her of what she'd lost. I don't blame her. But you blame yourself. Every single day. The honesty of it was brutal. No deflection, no attempt to soften the truth. Just the raw admission that he carried that weight, had carried it for 7 years, probably would carry it until the day he died. What was his name? Claire asked. Your wingman. Daniel hesitated, and she saw him weighing whether to share this piece of himself, this sacred memorial he'd been guarding in silence. Marcus. Marcus Sullivan. Claire felt the universe twist with the coincidence. Her Marcus, demanding perfect numbers from his hospital bed of exhaustion. Daniel's Marcus, forever frozen at whatever age he'd been when his plane went down. Two men, same name, different fates. He was a good pilot, Daniel continued, his voice distant now, speaking to memory. Better than me in some ways. Steadier, less reckless. We'd flown together for 3 years, knew each other's moves before we made them. That kind of partnership, it's... He stopped, searching for words. It's rare. You trust someone with your life every time you go up, and you know they're trusting you the same way. What went wrong on the mission? Surface-to-air missile we didn't see coming. By the time we registered the threat, Marcus was already between it and the civilians on the ground. He could have evaded, should have evaded, but that would have meant the missile hitting the evacuation convoy. 23 people, mostly women and kids, trying to get out of a war zone. Daniel's hands clenched on his knees, knuckles white. He made his choice in about 2 seconds, drew the missile away from the convoy, gave them time to scatter, saved 23 lives, cost him his own. And I was right there, watching it happen, couldn't do a damn thing to stop it. Claire felt tears on her face and was startled to realize they were her own. When was the last time she'd cried? Her parents' funeral, probably. She'd learned young that tears were weakness, that emotion was vulnerability, that the world rewarded those who kept their faces hard and their hearts harder. He was a hero, she said. He was a husband and father who should have gone home to his family. Daniel's voice cracked slightly. Those 23 people he saved, they got to go on living, got to go home, raise their kids, have careers and birthdays and ordinary Tuesdays. Marcus's kids got a flag and a medal and a father-shaped hole in their lives. Tell me how that's fair. It's not. No, it's not. And I'm the one who led that mission. I'm the one who made the tactical decisions that put us in that position. I'm the one who lived. They sat with that truth between them, heavy and immovable as the mountains outside. Around them, the terminal continued its evening rhythm, announcements echoing, wheels on tile, the universal sounds of transit and temporary existence. Claire's phone buzzed again. She ignored it. So you became a mechanic, she said. Stayed close to planes, but not in them. Seemed like penance. Or maybe just the only thing I knew how to do that didn't require me to trust myself with other people's lives. He leaned back in his chair, exhaustion written in every line of his body. I'm good at it. Inspection, repair, maintenance. I can read an aircraft like a book, find problems before they become catastrophic. It's honest work. Quiet work. Nobody's life depends on split-second decisions I might get wrong. Until today. Yeah, until today. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Funny how life works. Spend 7 years hiding on the ground, and the sky finds you anyway. You weren't hiding, Claire said. You were healing. There's a difference. He looked at her with something like surprise. You sound pretty sure about that. I've spent the last hour thinking about who I've become, who I've been. Success and achievement and climbing higher. It was all compensation for the fact that I had no idea who I was underneath it all. She gestured at the terminal, at the world beyond. I built an empire and forgot to build a life. You did the opposite. Maybe we both needed today to figure out we were wrong. I wasn't wrong about leaving, Daniel said quietly. I couldn't have kept flying, not after Marcus. No, but maybe you were wrong about the part where you decided you didn't deserve to do anything important ever again. He was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. You don't know what it's like. Making a decision that gets someone killed. You're right, I don't. But I know what it's like to make decisions that hurt people. I've fired employees before Christmas, crashed stock prices to acquire companies, destroyed careers because they were obstacles to growth. I told myself it was just business, that the numbers justified everything. But the numbers don't hold your hand when you're dying. The spreadsheets don't care if you lived a good life. Claire pulled out her phone, showing him the note she'd written in those terrible minutes before landing. I wrote this when I thought we were going to die. It's probably pathetic, but it's the truth. I was wrong about everything that mattered. Daniel read the note, his expression unreadable. When he looked up, there was something different in his eyes. Not forgiveness exactly, but recognition. The acknowledgement that they'd both been carrying their own wreckage, different in specifics, but identical in weight. "So what now?" he asked, handing back her phone. "You go back to your empire, I go back to Montana, and we chalk this up to a really intense Tuesday? Is that what you want?" "I don't know what I want. I haven't let myself want anything for 7 years except to be left alone." "And how's that working out for you?" He laughed, a short, sharp sound without much humor. "Not great, apparently. The universe keeps trying to drag me back into situations where I have to care about outcomes. Maybe the universe is smarter than you are. Maybe the universe should mind its own business." They fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not the weighted quiet of strangers, but the comfortable pause of two people who'd shared something profound and were still figuring out what it meant. An airport official approached, a harried-looking woman with a clipboard and the air of someone dealing with a logistical nightmare. "Excuse me, are you two from the Geneva flight?" "Yes," Claire said. "We're arranging hotel accommodations for all passengers. The aircraft won't be cleared for flight for at least 48 hours, obviously. We're working with the airlines to get everyone rebooked on alternative flights to their final destinations. If you'll come with me to the processing area—" "Actually," Daniel interrupted, "I need to get to Montana. What's the fastest route from here?" The official consulted her clipboard. "From Scion to Montana would require multiple connections. Let me see what I can find. And you, ma'am?" Claire started to say Milan, then stopped. The board meeting seemed so distant now, so utterly insignificant compared to everything that had happened. Marcus could handle the presentation. Or they'd reschedule. For the first time in her career, the idea of missing a high-stakes meeting didn't fill her with panic. "I'm flexible," she said. "Whatever works." The official made notes. "I'll get back to you both within the hour. In the meantime, there's food and beverages in the passenger lounge, and we have counselors available if anyone needs to talk through what happened." She moved on to the next group of passengers, leaving Claire and Daniel alone again. "Montana," Claire said. "You're that eager to get back to population 4,200? "I'm that eager to get away from this." He gestured vaguely at the terminal, but she understood he meant the attention, the questions, the inevitable media circus that was already forming around their miracle landing. "They're going to want to interview you. The pilot who saved 300 people. That's a hell of a story." "It's not my story to tell. I just flew a plane. That's all." "That's not all, and you know it." "Maybe, but I don't owe the world my trauma as entertainment." His voice was firm now, the same command she'd heard over the intercom. "I did what needed doing. I'm not a hero. I'm just a guy who used to know how to fly and got lucky that I still remembered enough to matter." Claire wanted to argue, to point out that luck had nothing to do with the precision and skill required to land a powerless aircraft in a mountain valley. But she recognized the futility of it. Daniel had built his entire post-military life around being invisible, and today had destroyed that invisibility in the most spectacular way possible. He was going to retreat to Montana and bury himself in anonymity as quickly as humanly possible. She respected that. Didn't agree with it, but respected it. Her phone rang again. This time she looked at the caller ID, her assistant, probably fielding dozens of emergency calls. She answered, "Claire, thank God, we saw the news. Are you okay? Is it true you were on the plane that—" "I'm fine, Sarah. Everyone's fine. Look, I need you to do something for me. Anything. Postpone the Milan meeting. Tell the board I'll video conference in tomorrow if they can't wait, but I'm not going to be there in person." Silence on the other end. In 5 years of working for Claire Morgan, Sarah had never heard her postpone a board meeting. "Are you sure you're okay? Did you hit your head or—" "I'm perfectly fine, just handling some things here. I'll be back in San Francisco in a few days. Until then, you're in charge of anything that can't wait." "Claire, the shareholders are going to—" "Let them. I'll deal with it when I get back." She ended the call before Sarah could protest further. Daniel was watching her with what might have been amusement. "That sounded important," he said. "It was. Until about an hour ago." Claire put her phone away. Funny how priorities shift when you nearly die. They shift back pretty quick usually. Give it a week, you'll be right back where you were. "Will you?" The question hung between them. Daniel looked away toward the windows where dusk was settling over the Alps, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold. Beautiful and indifferent, the same peaks that had almost claimed them. I don't know, he admitted. Part of me wants to pretend today never happened. Get back to my shop, back to routine, back to not having to think about the sky except as something other people travel through. And the other part can't stop thinking about how it felt, being up there again, having to trust my training, my instincts, making decisions that mattered. He turned back to her. I'd forgotten what that was like, the weight of it, the clarity. For 15 minutes, I wasn't the guy who got his friend killed. I was just a pilot doing his job. Maybe that's who you always were. You just convinced yourself you were someone else. Or maybe I'm both. The guy who saved 300 people today, and the guy who couldn't save the one person who mattered most 7 years ago. Those things aren't mutually exclusive. No, but they don't cancel each other out either. An announcement echoed through the terminal, something about delayed flights and passenger assistance. The normal machinery of crisis management, systems designed to handle disruption and return everyone to their planned trajectories. Claire found herself not wanting to return to her planned trajectory. The thought was so foreign to her nature that she almost laughed. She'd spent 20 years building Morgan Technologies with single-minded focus, never deviating, never questioning whether the destination was worth the journey. And now, sitting in a Swiss airport with a man she'd met 5 hours ago, she was questioning everything. I have a proposal, she said suddenly. Daniel raised an eyebrow. That sounds ominous. Hear me out. You saved my life today. Saved 300 lives, and yeah, I know you don't want to be called a hero, but that's what you are, whether you like it or not. I really don't like it. Noted. But here's the thing. What you did today shouldn't just be a one-time miracle. There are probably hundreds of small airports that need experienced pilots for emergencies, training, consultation. Thousands of people who could benefit from your knowledge. I told you, I don't fly anymore. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to teach. Share what you know. Help other people be ready for situations like today. Daniel was quiet, his expression wary. Why do you care what I do? Because you reminded me that the most important things in life have nothing to do with quarterly earnings or market share. Because I have resources and connections and absolutely no idea what actually matters. And because maybe, if we both stop running from what happened to us, we could do something worthwhile. That's a pretty speech. But I'm not a project for you to fix so you can feel better about being a ruthless CEO. The words stung because they were partly true. Claire had a habit of turning everything into a business proposition, a problem to solve, a challenge to overcome. But this felt different. This felt like the first genuine impulse she'd had in years that wasn't about profit or power. You're right, she said. I'm approaching this all wrong. Forget the proposal. Forget everything I just said. I'm going to ask you something simpler. What? Can I buy you dinner? No agenda, no business pitch. Just two people who survived something terrible and maybe want to not be alone with it for a few hours. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, and she saw him weighing his instinct to retreat against something else. Maybe loneliness, maybe curiosity, maybe just the recognition that running away had stopped working the moment he'd stood up and said, I can fly. Okay, he said finally. Dinner. But you're not buying. We'll split it. I'm a billionaire. I don't care. We split it or I'm eating alone. Claire laughed, surprising herself. Deal. They found a restaurant in the terminal, not fancy, just a quiet place with decent food and fewer people than the main concourse. The waitress seated them by a window overlooking the runway, where their crippled aircraft still sat, surrounded by emergency vehicles and investigation crews. Weird to look at it from here, Daniel said, studying the plane. From inside, you don't realize how damaged it is. From out here, it's obvious we should all be dead. But we're not. But we're not. He picked up the menu, scanning it with the careful attention of someone used to calculating costs. I'm getting the cheapest thing on here, just so you know. Get whatever you want. I won't judge. You judged me pretty hard a few hours ago. Claire winced. Are you going to let me live that down? Probably not. It's kind of funny now. You were so certain I didn't belong in business class. Then it turned out I was the only person on the plane qualified to save everyone's life. The universe has a sick sense of humor. Yeah, it really does. They ordered. Daniel got a burger despite her encouragement to try the steak. Claire got pasta she barely tasted. The conversation flowed easier than it should have between two people who'd started the day as strangers. Crisis had a way of stripping away the usual social distance, creating intimacy whether you wanted it or not. Daniel talked about Montana, about the small shop where he worked on everything from crop dusters to private jets, about the town where everyone knew everyone, and Tuesday nights at the diner were the social event of the week, about the peace he'd found in anonymity and routine. Claire talked about San Francisco, about building an empire from nothing, about the loneliness of success when you'd sacrificed every relationship to achieve it, about the moment she had realized, falling toward the Alps, that she'd built a monument to her own isolation. "You have anyone waiting for you back home?" Daniel asked. "Significant other? Family?" "No. I had my parents, but they died when I was 25. Car accident. After that, I threw myself into work. Built Morgan Technologies from a garage startup into what it is now. Never had time for relationships. Never wanted them, honestly. They seemed like distractions. And now? Now I'm not so sure. Turns out when you think you're going to die, you don't think about quarterly earnings or stock prices. You think about all the people you never let yourself care about." Daniel nodded slowly. "Marcus's wife told me something at the funeral. She said the worst part wasn't that he died doing something dangerous. He'd always known that was possible. The worst part was that she'd spent their entire marriage sharing him with the military, and now she didn't even get the memories of having him all to herself. That's brutal." "Yeah, but it's true. I watched him miss birthdays and anniversaries because of deployments. Watched him FaceTime his kids from halfway around the world. He loved them more than anything, but the job always came first. Had to come first or you couldn't do it right." Daniel's hands tightened around his water glass. "I swore after he died that I'd never let work take priority over people again. Then I realized I didn't have any people to prioritize. So I just stopped. Stopped trying, stopped caring, figured it was safer that way." "Safer for who?" "For everyone. Can't lose people if you don't let them get close. Can't live either." "No," he agreed quietly. "You can't." The restaurant was emptying out as the evening wore on. Most of the other passengers from their flight had either found hotels or been rebooked on alternative routes. Through the window, Claire could see maintenance crews still working on their aircraft, documenting damage, trying to understand what had gone wrong. "They're going to want your statement," she said, nodding toward the plane. "Aviation investigators. They'll want to know everything about the flight." "I know. I already talked to them briefly, told them about the engine failure, the landing. They'll want more detail later." "Will you tell them? About your military background?" "Have to. It's relevant to how I was able to land the plane." He sighed. "And then it'll be public record. Anyone who wants to dig will find out about Marcus, about what happened, about why I quit flying." "Does that bother you?" "Everything about this bothers me. I didn't want to be a hero, didn't want attention. Definitely didn't want to have to relive the worst day of my life for a bunch of investigators and reporters." "You could refuse to talk to the media." "Yeah, and they'll just make up their own story. Probably get half of it wrong and turn it into some redemption narrative that has nothing to do with reality." He pushed his plate away, the burger only half eaten. "Sorry. I know I sound ungrateful. 300 people are alive because of what happened today. That matters. I know it matters. But it doesn't erase what you lost." "No, it doesn't." They sat in silence, watching the investigation crews work under harsh portable lights. The scene had a surreal quality. Emergency response bleeding into routine documentation, crisis becoming bureaucracy. Claire's phone buzzed with another call. She glanced at it, a number she didn't recognize, probably press trying to get a statement. She declined it. "You're going to have to deal with them eventually," Daniel said. "I know, but not tonight. Tonight I'm just—" She stopped, searching for the right words. "Tonight I'm just grateful to be alive. Everything else can wait." "You really mean that?" "Yeah, I really do." Daniel studied her across the table, his gray eyes searching her face like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "You're different than I thought you'd be. When you got on the plane, all expensive clothes and cold efficiency, I figured you were just another executive who thought the world revolved around her schedule. I was. This morning, that's exactly who I was. And now? Now I don't know who I am, but I know who I don't want to be anymore. The waitress brought their check. Daniel grabbed it before Claire could, studying the total with the same intensity he'd probably applied to landing coordinates. He pulled out his wallet, worn leather, nearly empty, and counted out enough cash to cover his half-plus tip. Claire pulled out her credit card for her portion, and they completed the transaction in silence. It felt important somehow, this insistence on equality, on neither of them owing the other anything beyond what they'd already shared. Outside the restaurant, the terminal had quieted for the night. Most flights were grounded until morning, leaving only the overnight staff and a few stranded passengers trying to sleep in uncomfortable chairs. I should find where they're putting us up, Daniel said. Hotel or whatever they arranged. Yeah, me too. But neither of them moved. They stood there in the nearly empty terminal, two people who'd shared the most intense experience of their lives, and were now facing the inevitable separation that followed crisis. Tomorrow or the next day, they'd go their separate ways. Claire back to San Francisco and Empire Management, Daniel back to Montana and deliberate obscurity. The thought made Claire unexpectedly sad. Can I ask you something? She said. Sure. Do you regret it, stepping forward today, taking control of that plane? Daniel was quiet for a long time, his gaze distant. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. Ask me again in a year. Right now, I'm still too close to it to know. Part of me is terrified that I just proved I can still do the thing I swore I'd never do again. Part of me is... He paused, searching for words. Part of me felt alive up there in a way I haven't felt in 7 years. That sounds like an answer. Maybe. Or maybe it's just adrenaline talking. The airport official from earlier appeared, waving them over to where she'd set up a desk with information packets. There you are. I've got you both sorted. We have rooms at the Alpine Hotel about 10 minutes from here. Shuttle leaves in 20 minutes. And I've got preliminary flight options for both of you to review. She handed them each a folder with hotel vouchers and flight information. Claire glanced through hers. Options back to San Francisco via Zurich or Frankfurt, all departing in the next 48 hours. Daniel was staring at his options like they represented impossible choices. Montana via Munich and Denver, or Montana via London and Salt Lake City. Long routes, multiple connections, the opposite of direct. These all leave tomorrow or the day after, he said to the official. Is there anything sooner? I'm afraid not. The incident has created quite a backlog, and with your specific routing needs, Montana isn't exactly a major hub. He nodded, accepting this with visible resignation. The idea of spending another day or two in Switzerland, fielding questions and attention, clearly bothered him more than Claire would have guessed. Thank you, she told the official, taking her folder. We'll be on the shuttle. They collected their minimal belongings, Claire's laptop bag, Daniel's small backpack that probably contained everything he owned, and headed for the shuttle pickup area. The night air was cold and sharp with the promise of snow, carrying the clean mountain scent that reminded Claire how far they were from the familiar warmth of California. The shuttle was nearly empty, just them and 3 other passengers from their flight, an elderly couple and a young woman who'd cried through the entire landing. They all nodded at each other in recognition, survivors sharing a bond they'd never asked for. The hotel was modest but clean, the kind of place that served tourists during ski season and international travelers in transit the rest of the year. The lobby was warm and smelled of coffee and pine, a deliberate attempt at alpine charm that somehow worked. Daniel Ross and Claire Morgan? The desk clerk asked, checking them in with efficient friendliness. You're both on the 3rd floor. Breakfast is included, served from 6 to 10. If you need anything, just call down. He handed them each a key card. Room 312 for Claire. Room 315 for Daniel. Same floor, a few doors apart. They rode the elevator in silence, exhaustion finally catching up with them. The numbers climbed, 1, 2, 3, and the doors opened onto a quiet hallway carpeted in something meant to evoke mountain meadows. This is me, Claire said, stopping at 312. Daniel continued a few steps, then paused at his own door. He turned back to face her, and in the fluorescent hallway lighting, she could see how drained he looked, not just tired, but hollowed out, running on fumes and willpower. Thanks for dinner, he said. Thanks for saving my life. A slight smile. You're welcome. They stood there in the hallway, neither quite ready to say goodnight, both understanding that walking into their separate rooms meant acknowledging the end of something neither could name. The intimacy of shared crisis was already beginning to fade, reality reasserting itself in the form of hotel keycards and separate floors of their actual lives. Get some rest, Claire said finally. You look like you're about to collapse. Feel like it too. Daniel slid his keycard into the lock, then paused. Claire? Yeah? What you said earlier, about doing something worthwhile. I've been thinking about it. Her heart quickened slightly. And I don't know yet, but I'm thinking about it. He pushed open his door. Good night. Good night, Daniel. She watched him disappear into his room before entering her own. The space was simple but comfortable. Queen bed with white linen, small desk, window overlooking the darkened mountains. Her laptop bag sat where she'd dropped it, filled with work she suddenly couldn't imagine caring about. Claire kicked off her shoes and sat on the edge of the bed, the events of the day finally catching up with her in a wave of exhaustion, so profound it felt physical. She'd woken up that morning in Geneva, prepared for a routine flight and a high-stakes board meeting. She was ending it in a Swiss hotel, alive by grace of a man she'd judged unworthy of sitting beside her. The universe's sense of irony was indeed sick. Her phone showed 47 missed calls and over 100 unread emails. She scrolled through them mechanically. Board members demanding updates, news outlets requesting interviews, competitors probably wondering if this would affect Morgan Technology's stock price. The entire apparatus of her professional life continuing to turn even as she sat here feeling like a different person entirely. One email caught her attention. Subject line, "From the flight attendant you met today." Claire opened it. Miss Morgan, I hope this email finds you well and recovering from today's events. I wanted to reach out personally to thank you for your composure during the emergency. More importantly, I wanted to share something about Daniel Ross that I think you should know. After everyone had deplaned, I found him sitting alone in the cockpit, hands shaking so badly he could barely unbuckle his harness. He'd held it together perfectly while we needed him, then fell apart the moment no one was watching. He wouldn't let the paramedics help him, wouldn't accept any recognition, just kept saying he needed to leave, needed to get away before people started asking questions. I've worked in aviation for 15 years, and I've never seen someone carry that much pain so quietly. Whatever happened to him before today, it's still destroying him. I thought you should know. He saved us all, but I don't think anyone's ever saved him. Respectfully, Gabrielle Fournier. Claire read the email 3 times, each pass adding weight to the already heavy understanding of who Daniel Ross was. A man who could land a dying plane with surgeon-like precision, then collapse when the crisis passed. A man running so hard from his past that even heroism felt like failure. She wanted to go to his room, to check on him, to do something. But what? She barely knew him, had no right to intrude on his carefully maintained distance. Their connection existed only in the context of crisis. Remove the emergency and they were just 2 strangers who happened to share a traumatic Tuesday. Instead, she replied to Gabrielle's email with a simple thank you, then set her phone aside and tried to sleep. It didn't come. She lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, replaying the day in fragmented images. The oil stains on Daniel's hands, the terror of descent. His voice over the intercom, steady as stone while the world fell apart. The way he'd looked at her in the terminal, not with anger at her judgment, but with the weary acceptance of someone who'd stopped expecting better from people. Around 2 a.m, she heard a door open in the hallway. Footsteps. The elevator chiming. Curiosity pulled her out of bed. She cracked her door open just enough to see Daniel's back disappearing into the elevator, wearing the same clothes from earlier, moving with the restless energy of someone who couldn't sleep and had given up trying. Claire threw on jeans and a sweater and followed. The elevator took her to the lobby, where she found Daniel sitting in a corner armchair, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the mountains barely visible under starlight. A cup of coffee sat untouched on the table beside him. Couldn't sleep either? She asked, approaching slowly. He didn't seem surprised to see her. Nightmares. Figured I'd spare whoever has the room next to mine the sound of me waking up screaming. The casual way he said it, like nightmares were just routine maintenance, another symptom to be managed, broke something in Claire's chest. Want company? She asked. Shouldn't you be working? I saw how many calls you were ignoring. They can wait. She sat in the chair across from him. Talk to me. About what? Whatever you want. Or nothing. Just don't sit here alone at 2 a.m. carrying all this by yourself. Daniel picked up his coffee, holding it without drinking. His hands were steadier than they'd been in the terminal, but she could still see the tremor. I keep seeing it, he said quietly. The landing. Except in my head, it goes wrong. We clip the mountain, or I misjudge the approach. Or the landing gear fails on impact. 300 different ways it could have ended with everyone dead. But it didn't. This time it didn't. 7 years ago it did. I made decisions, and Marcus died. Today I made decisions, and everyone lived. How is that fair? What's different between then and now except luck? Claire leaned forward. You want to know what I think? Not really, but you're going to tell me anyway. 7 years ago, you were in combat, making split-second decisions in a situation designed to kill you. You and Marcus both knew the risks, both accepted them, and when the moment came, he made a choice that saved civilians. That wasn't your failure, that was his courage. I should have seen the threat sooner, should have positioned us differently, should have been psychic? Come on, Daniel, you're holding yourself to an impossible standard. Maybe I need to. Maybe that's the only way I can live with what happened. Or maybe it's the way you punish yourself for surviving when he didn't. The words hung between them, brutal in their honesty. Daniel's face tightened, but he didn't deny it. His kids, he said after a long silence. Emma and Jack. They'd be 10 and 12 now. I wonder about them all the time. Wonder if they remember him, if they hate me for coming home when their dad didn't. Have you ever tried to find out? To reach out? What would I say? Sorry your father died saving strangers while I survived? Sorry I'm still here enjoying coffee at 2 a.m. while he's been gone for 7 years? You could say you think about them, that their father was a hero, that his sacrifice mattered. They know that. They don't need me telling them. Maybe they don't need it, but maybe you do. Daniel set his coffee down and rubbed his face with both hands, exhaustion and frustration evident in the gesture. Why do you care? We barely know each other. Tomorrow or the next day, we'll go our separate ways and probably never see each other again. Why does this matter to you? It was a fair question. Claire searched for an answer that made sense, that didn't sound like savior complex or misplaced gratitude. Because you're the first person I've met in years who feels real. Everyone in my world is playing roles: ambitious executive, loyal employee, cutthroat competitor. You're just you, broken and honest and trying so hard to be invisible that it hurts to watch. I'm not trying to be invisible. I'm trying to survive. By hiding in a Montana town and fixing planes instead of flying them? It works. Does it? Because from where I'm sitting, you look like someone drowning in slow motion. Daniel's eyes flashed with something sharp, anger maybe, or recognition he didn't want to acknowledge. You've known me for 1 day. You don't get to psychoanalyze my life choices. You're right, I don't. I'm sorry. Claire stood, suddenly aware that she'd pushed too far, crossed boundaries she had no business crossing. I should let you get back to not sleeping. Wait. Daniel stood too, and they faced each other across the space between hotel armchairs. You're not wrong. About the drowning part, I just don't know what the alternative is. I can't go back to flying, can't trust myself with that responsibility, can't risk... He stopped, the words catching in his throat. Can't risk caring about something enough that losing it destroys you again, Claire finished quietly. Yeah, that. They stood there in the hotel lobby at 2 a.m, two broken people recognizing the fractures in each other. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall, silent and beautiful, covering the mountains in fresh white. I have an idea, Claire said suddenly. Probably a terrible one, but hear me out. Daniel looked wary. I'm listening. Don't fly back to Montana tomorrow. Come with me to San Francisco for a few days. Let me show you something I've been working on, a project that could use someone with your expertise. I told you, I'm not interested in corporate consulting or whatever you're pitching. It's not corporate, it's personal. Something I've been thinking about since my parents died, but never had the guts to actually pursue. She took a breath. I want to start a foundation. Training programs for pilots, support systems for military families dealing with loss, real resources for people who fall through the cracks of the system. Daniel's expression shifted, suspicion giving way to cautious interest. Why now? Why this? Because today reminded me that life is short and most of what I spend my time on doesn't matter. Because I have money and connections and no idea how to actually help people. Because you know what those families need and I know how to build things that last. She met his eyes. Because maybe we both need to stop running from what broke us and start building something from the pieces. That's a hell of a pitch for 2 a.m. Is it working? He was quiet for a long time, weighing something she couldn't see. Finally, he said, 3 days. I'll give you 3 days in San Francisco. Then I'm going home to Montana, whether this works out or not. Claire felt something unlock in her chest. Relief, excitement, the terrifying possibility that maybe she wasn't going to face tomorrow alone. Deal. We'll fly out tomorrow evening. Give us both time to recover. Deal with investigators. Handle the immediate chaos. You're assuming I'm going to be useful for this project. You landed a plane with no engines. I'm pretty sure you can handle whatever I throw at you. A ghost of a smile crossed Daniel's face. You're persistent. I'll give you that. Built $1 billion company on persistence. Yeah, I've noticed. He picked up his cold coffee, finally taking a sip and grimacing at the temperature. I should probably try to sleep. Long day tomorrow dealing with everyone who wants to call me a hero. You are a hero. I'm a mechanic who got lucky. There's a difference. Not from where I was sitting. They rode the elevator back up to the 3rd floor in comfortable silence, the ease of people who'd moved past the awkward stage of acquaintance into something deeper. The hallway was still empty, their footsteps muffled by carpet. Room 312, Claire said, stopping at her door. See you in the morning? See you in the morning. Daniel continued to his own room, then paused. Claire? Yeah? Thanks for not letting me sit down there alone. Anytime. She watched him disappear into room 315 before entering her own space. This time, sleep came easier, her mind finally quiet enough to rest. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the day's trauma and fresh possibility. Morning arrived with weak sunlight filtering through mountain clouds. Claire woke to her phone buzzing insistently. More calls, more emails, the world demanding her attention with its usual impatience. She ignored it all and ordered room service instead, eating breakfast while watching news coverage of yesterday's emergency landing. The footage was surreal. Their plane approaching the runway at a dangerous angle, wheels hitting hard enough to send sparks flying, the aircraft slewing sideways before straightening and rolling to a stop. The video had been taken by someone at the airport, probably on their phone, and it had already gone viral. 12 million views overnight. The news anchor was calling it a miracle. The aviation expert they'd brought on was explaining, in technical terms, why what Daniel had done should have been impossible. A retired Air Force general was speculating about the pilot's military background based on the precision of the approach. Claire's phone rang again. This time she answered. Ms. Morgan, this is Catherine Walsh from the FAA. I'm leading the investigation into yesterday's incident. I understand you were a passenger on the flight. Yes, business class, seat 2A. I need to schedule a formal interview to get your account of what happened. Would you be available later this morning? Claire glanced at the clock. 10:30. I can be available at 1 o'clock. Where? We've set up at the airport administration building. I'll send you the address. I'll be there. Can I ask, have you interviewed Daniel Ross yet? The pilot who landed the plane? A pause. Mr. Ross has been cooperative, but understandably exhausted. We've gotten preliminary information, but we'll need more extensive debriefing. Why do you ask? Just curious how he's doing. He seemed pretty drained last night. That's not uncommon after the kind of stress he experienced. Landing an aircraft without engine power requires extraordinary skill and creates tremendous psychological pressure. We're making sure he has access to counseling resources. After ending the call, Claire texted Daniel. Got called in for FAA interview at 1 p.m. You? His response came quickly. Same, 2 p.m. Not looking forward to it. She replied, Want to grab lunch first? Another pause, longer this time. Then, sure, lobby at noon? The investigative interview was exactly as tedious as Claire had anticipated. 2 hours of detailed questioning about everything she'd observed from the moment she boarded the plane. What time did she notice the turbulence? Had she seen anything unusual before the emergency? What was the sequence of events as she recalled them? Could she describe the pilot's demeanor and communication? She answered everything honestly, including her initial dismissal of Daniel and her complete shock when he turned out to be their only hope of survival. The investigator, a stern woman in her 50s with sharp eyes, made careful notes. Mr. Ross has an interesting background, Walsh said carefully. 10 years military aviation, honorable discharge, then 7 years working ground crew. That's quite a shift. He's a private person. I don't think he wants that background examined too closely. Unfortunately for Mr. Ross, this incident is going to attract significant attention. The public is already calling him a hero. We've had media requests from every major news outlet in North America and Europe. His privacy is going to be difficult to maintain. Claire felt protective anger rise in her chest. He saved 300 lives and doesn't want recognition. Seems like his privacy should be respected. I agree, but I'm not in control of public interest. Walsh closed her notebook. That's all I need from you for now, Ms. Morgan. We may have follow-up questions as the investigation continues. The preliminary findings suggest fuel contamination, possibly introduced during routine servicing in Geneva. We're working with Swiss authorities to determine the source. How long until the plane is cleared to fly again? At least a week, possibly longer. The damage from the hard landing was significant. I understand you were rerouted to San Francisco? Yes, departing this evening. Safe travels. And Ms. Morgan? Walsh's expression softened slightly. For what it's worth, you were very fortunate to have someone like Mr. Ross on board. Most pilots wouldn't have been able to do what he did. Claire found Daniel in the lobby at 6, both of them freshly showered and wearing the clothes the hotel had laundered overnight. He looked better than he had in the early morning hours. Still tired, but steadier, the worst of the shock having worn off. How was your interview? She asked. Long, detailed. They wanted to know everything about the flight characteristics, the approach, the landing sequence. I think I described the same 30 seconds about 15 different ways. He rubbed the back of his neck. Yours? Similar. They're very interested in you. Yeah, I noticed. Walsh mentioned the media requests. Apparently I'm trending on social media. He said it with such distaste that Claire almost laughed. Fame doesn't agree with you. Fame is what happens to people who want attention. I want the opposite of attention. Should have thought of that before you landed a plane without engines. Next time I'll let us crash, much more private. They collected their minimal luggage. Claire had sent Sarah emergency shopping instructions and would have fresh clothes waiting in San Francisco. Daniel apparently traveled with a single backpack and nothing else, and took a taxi to the airport. The terminal was still dealing with the aftermath of yesterday's incident. Their flight had created a backlog that would take days to resolve. But commercial aviation was nothing if not resilient. Flights were departing, passengers were traveling, the system was adapting. Their flight to San Francisco was direct, 8 hours that would take them from afternoon Swiss time to evening California time. The airline had upgraded both of them to first class, probably recognizing Daniel's name from the news coverage and making the business decision that keeping the hero comfortable was good publicity. Daniel stared at his first-class ticket with something like despair. You've got to be kidding me. What's wrong? I just want to be a normal passenger. Sit in coach, be ignored, maybe sleep if I can. Now I'm going to be in first class where everyone's going to recognize me and want to talk about yesterday. So wear a hat and sunglasses, pretend to sleep. That's your solution? Disguise? Got a better idea? He didn't, so they boarded with Claire's strategy in place. Daniel pulled a baseball cap low over his face and slouched in his seat like he was already asleep. Claire took the seat beside him. They'd somehow ended up in the same row again, the universe apparently unwilling to let them separate. The flight attendant recognized them immediately. Of course she did. Claire could see the moment of connection in her eyes. These were the passengers from the miracle landing. Mr. Ross, she said quietly, leaning down so only they could hear. On behalf of the entire crew, thank you for what you did yesterday. We all heard about it. You're an inspiration. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he managed a nod. Just did what needed doing. Well, we're honored to have you aboard. If you need anything at all during the flight, please let us know. She moved on, and Daniel sank deeper into his seat. This is going to be the longest 8 hours of my life. Welcome to being famous. I hate it already. The flight was mercifully uneventful. Clear skies, smooth air, the kind of routine journey that would have bored Claire to tears a week ago, but now felt like a gift. She worked on her laptop for a while, drafting the framework for the foundation she'd proposed to Daniel. Training programs for emergency response pilots. Scholarship funds for children of military families dealing with loss. Support networks for veterans transitioning to civilian life. It felt right in a way her usual work never had. Building Morgan Technologies had been about proving something, to herself, to the world, to the memory of parents who'd never see what she accomplished. This was different. This was about using her resources to actually help people, to create something that mattered beyond quarterly earnings. Beside her, Daniel had given up on pretending to sleep and was staring out the window at the Atlantic passing beneath them. She could see him in the reflection of the glass, the scar on his face, the fatigue in his eyes, the weight he carried in the set of his shoulders. "What are you thinking about?" she asked quietly. Marcus's kids, Emma and Jack, wondering if they saw the news coverage, if they recognized my name and made the connection. Would that be bad? I don't know. Part of me hopes they did. Hopes they know I'm still trying to honor what their father died for. Part of me is terrified they'll reach out and I'll have to face them after all these years. What would you say if they did? Daniel was quiet for a long time. That their father was the bravest person I ever knew. That he saved 23 lives that day, including kids not much younger than they were. That I've spent 7 years wishing I could have saved him the way he saved those strangers. You should tell them that. Maybe. Someday. When I'm less of a coward about it. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, announcing their initial descent into San Francisco. Claire looked out the window, seeing the California coast emerging from the haze, the familiar shape of the bay that had been home for 20 years. Last chance to back out, she told Daniel. You could catch a connecting flight to Montana tonight. Be home by morning. Is that what you want? No, but I want you to be here because you choose to be, not because you feel obligated. Daniel turned from the window to face her directly. I'm here because I want to see what you build. Because maybe you're right that I've been drowning in Montana and need something to pull me out. And because, he paused, choosing words carefully, because you're the first person in 7 years who's looked at me and seen someone worth saving. The honesty of it took Claire's breath away. You were always worth saving. You just convinced yourself otherwise. Maybe. We'll see. They landed at SFO as the sun was setting, painting the bay in shades of gold and crimson. Claire had arranged for a car service, and they were whisked through the terminal before too many people could recognize Daniel from the news coverage. A few did double takes, phones coming out to snap photos, but they made it to the car without incident. San Francisco greeted them with its usual chaos, traffic on 101, the skyline rising against the Pacific, the eclectic mix of tech wealth and bohemian culture that defined the city. Claire's apartment was in Pacific Heights, overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge and the Marin headlands beyond. This is where you live? Daniel asked as they pulled up to the building. Jesus, it's just an apartment. It's a palace. How many bedrooms? 4, but I only use 1. The rest are just there. She could see him processing this, comparing it to whatever small place he rented in Montana. The gulf between their lives was evident in every detail. Her doorman greeting her by name, the marble lobby, the private elevator to her penthouse. Her apartment was exactly as she'd left it 4 days ago when she'd departed for Geneva. Minimalist furniture, expensive art she'd bought because decorators said she should, floor-to-ceiling windows with views that would sell for millions on their own. It was beautiful and sterile and utterly empty of anything resembling life. You can take the guest room, Claire said, showing Daniel down the hall. Bathroom's through there. Make yourself comfortable. He set his backpack down, looking around the space with something like discomfort. This is bigger than my entire apartment. I told you, I don't know how to build a life, just empires and real estate portfolios. At least you're honest about it. Claire ordered dinner from her usual place. Thai food that arrived in 20 minutes, expensive and flavorless. They ate on her balcony, watching the city lights come alive as full darkness fell. "Tell me about the foundation," Daniel said. "Specifics. What exactly are you planning?" She pulled out her laptop, showing him the framework she'd drafted on the plane. 3 main pillars: pilot training for emergency response situations, family support for military casualties, mental health resources for veterans struggling with transition. Daniel studied it carefully, his expression thoughtful. "This is ambitious. You're talking about a lot of infrastructure, a lot of overhead. I have the capital and the connections to make it happen quickly." Quick isn't always good with something like this. You need to get it right, hire the right people, build the right programs. Otherwise, it's just another rich person's vanity project that doesn't actually help anyone. That's why I need you. You know what these people need. What would have helped you after Marcus died? I didn't want help. I wanted my friend back. But if you couldn't have that, what would have made a difference? Daniel set the laptop aside and leaned back in his chair, gazing out at the bridge lights strung like jewels across the bay. Someone who understood, not a therapist reading from a manual about PTSD and survivor's guilt. Someone who'd been there, who knew what it felt like to make impossible choices and live with the consequences. Peer support. Yeah, and practical help, job training, financial counseling for families dealing with sudden loss. Marcus's wife had to sell their house. His military pension wasn't enough to cover the mortgage and raise 2 kids. She needed skills to support herself, but she'd been a stay-at-home mom for 6 years. The system wasn't designed for people like her. Claire made notes, her mind already working through implementation strategies. What else? Education funds for the kids. Guaranteed college tuition, so at least they don't have to worry about that on top of everything else. And maybe, he hesitated, maybe a program that connects kids who lost military parents with veterans who understand what their parents did. Give them mentors who can answer questions their mom can't. That's beautiful. That's personal. Emma and Jack deserve to know their father was a hero, but who's going to tell them that in a way that means something? Their mom was grieving. The military sends someone to deliver the bad news and then moves on. The kids are left with a flag and unanswered questions. So we answer the questions. We build the support system that should have existed. Daniel looked at her, and she saw something shift in his expression. The first real spark of hope she'd witnessed since they met. "You're serious about this?" "Completely serious. I have the money, you have the knowledge. Together we can build something that actually makes a difference." "And what do you get out of it, besides feeling good about helping people?" The question was fair. Claire considered it, searching for truth underneath her usual corporate motivations. Redemption, maybe. Or at least purpose. I've spent 20 years building something that makes me rich but doesn't make me happy. Maybe this is my chance to build something that matters. That's a lot of pressure to put on one foundation. I know, but it's the only thing I've cared about in years. They finished dinner in thoughtful silence, both processing what they were proposing to build together. It felt too big, too ambitious, too much like trying to heal wounds that couldn't be healed. But it also felt necessary, like the only path forward that didn't lead to more drowning and more hiding and more pretending that survival was the same as living. Claire's phone rang, Sarah probably checking in. She let it go to voicemail. Tomorrow she'd deal with the company, with the board, with all the professional obligations she'd been ignoring. Tonight was for planning something better. "I should warn you," Daniel said as they cleaned up the remains of dinner. "I'm going to be difficult about this. I'm going to push back on ideas I think are wrong. I'm not going to just nod and agree because you're funding everything." "Good. I need someone who'll tell me the truth, not someone who'll kiss up for a paycheck. And if this doesn't work, if we spend months building something that fails to help anyone, then we'll have tried, which is more than I can say about most of what I've done with my life." Daniel nodded slowly, acceptance settling over his features. "Okay, 3 days. Let's see what we can build." But they both knew it would take more than 3 days. This was the kind of project that could consume years, require complete restructuring of priorities, demand sacrifices neither of them had fully considered. Claire found herself not caring. For the first time since her parents died, she felt like she was moving towards something that mattered instead of running from something that hurt. The 3 days Daniel had promised turned into a week, then 2, then a month. What started as preliminary planning evolved into something neither of them had anticipated, a complete restructuring of how Claire thought about success and how Daniel thought about redemption. They worked from Claire's apartment most days, her dining table becoming command center for a project that grew more ambitious with each conversation. Daniel proved to be exactly what she'd hoped, challenging, thoughtful, unwilling to accept easy answers or surface-level solutions. He pushed back on every assumption, questioned every budget line, demanded proof that what they were building would actually help people instead of just making them feel good about helping. "This number here," he said one morning, pointing at her laptop screen. $2 million for administrative overhead in year 1. That's ridiculous. That's standard for a foundation this size. Legal fees, staffing, office space, it's wasteful. The people we're trying to help don't need you to rent fancy office space in downtown San Francisco. They need direct assistance, job training, counseling, education funding. Every dollar we spend on marble lobbies is a dollar we're not spending on actual support. Claire bristled at his tone, then caught herself. This was exactly why she'd brought him in, to stop her from building another monument to her own ego. "Okay, what do you suggest?" "Work remote as much as possible. Hire people who actually understand what military families need, not professional nonprofit managers who've never missed a meal in their lives. Keep overhead under $500,000 in year 1. Put the rest directly into programs." She made the changes, watching her carefully constructed budget transform into something leaner and more focused. It was humbling and exhilarating in equal measure, letting someone else's expertise reshape her vision into something better than she could have built alone. Sarah noticed the change immediately when Claire finally returned to the Morgan Technologies offices. "You're different," she said, standing in Claire's doorway with a tablet full of urgent matters. "What happened in Switzerland?" "I nearly died." "Then I didn't. Turns out that changes your perspective." "Clearly. The board is worried you've lost focus. Stock price dropped 2% when you postponed the Milan meeting." "Then it dropped. We'll recover." Claire signed the documents Sarah had brought without reading them as carefully as she normally would. "What else?" "Marcus wants to know if you're still planning to fire him for the imperfect numbers." Claire looked up sharply. "What? No, why would he think that?" "Because you told him perfect, or he's out before you left for Geneva." The memory came back. Claire on her phone in the airport, demanding perfection, threatening someone's job over quarterly projections that were already good, but not good enough for her impossible standards. She felt sick. "Get him on the phone," she said. "Now!" Sarah made the call, and Marcus's voice came through Claire's speakerphone, tight with anxiety. "Miss Morgan, I have the revised projections if you're ready to review." "Marcus, stop. I need to apologize. What I said before Geneva was out of line. Your work is excellent. You're not getting fired. You're getting a raise and a week of vacation, effective immediately." Silence on the other end. Then, cautiously, "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" "You heard me. Take your family somewhere nice. Send me the bill. And Marcus, I'm sorry for being the kind of boss who makes people afraid of doing good work instead of perfect work." After the call ended, Sarah stared at her. "Who are you and what have you done with Claire Morgan?" "I'm still Claire, just a version that's trying to be better." She closed her laptop. "Clear my schedule for the rest of the week. I have something more important to work on." The foundation took shape through late spring and into summer. They incorporated it as the Marcus Sullivan Foundation, Daniel's suggestion, made quietly one evening after too much wine and too many memories. Claire had expected him to resist putting his friend's name on something so public, but he'd seemed almost relieved. "Maybe it's time Emma and Jack knew their father's name still means something," he'd said, "that people remember." They hired carefully, a director who'd lost her brother in Afghanistan and understood grief from the inside, a counselor who specialized in military family trauma, a job training coordinator who'd helped hundreds of veterans transition to civilian careers. Each hire was someone who brought lived experience, not just professional credentials. The pilot training program proved more complex. Daniel insisted on developing curriculum himself, spending weeks writing detailed protocols for emergency response procedures. He consulted with aviation experts, tested scenarios, built training modules that went far beyond what Claire had originally envisioned. You're building something remarkable, she told him one evening, reviewing his latest draft. They were on her balcony again, the June fog rolling through the Golden Gate like smoke. This could become the standard for emergency aviation training nationwide. It needs to be. What happened to us? That shouldn't require a miracle. It should be survivable because pilots are properly trained and aircraft are properly maintained and the industry takes safety seriously instead of cutting corners for profit. You sound like you care about this. He looked at her, and she saw the truth in his eyes before he spoke it. I do. For the first time in 7 years, I care about something besides not caring. It's terrifying. Good terrifying or bad terrifying? Ask me when we launch, and I'll tell you. They set the launch for September, 6 months after the emergency landing that had brought them together. The plan was modest by Claire's usual standards. A small event in San Francisco, press release announcing the foundation's creation, initial program rollouts in 3 states. No fanfare, no celebrity endorsements, just quiet work aimed at people who needed help. But the universe had other plans. 2 weeks before the scheduled launch, Daniel's phone rang with a number he hadn't seen in 7 years. He stared at it for 3 full rings before answering, his face going pale. This is Daniel. Claire watched his expression shift through a dozen emotions in 30 seconds. Shock, grief, fear, something that might have been hope. When he ended the call, his hand was shaking. That was Marcus's wife, he said quietly. Jessica. She saw the news coverage from Switzerland, recognized my name. She wants to meet. The meeting happened on a Saturday morning at a coffee shop in Oakland, neutral territory chosen by Jessica. Claire offered to come along for moral support, but Daniel refused. This is something I need to do alone, he said. But will you wait somewhere nearby? In case I need, I don't know, just in case. She waited at a bookstore 3 blocks away, pretending to browse while checking her phone every 5 minutes. An hour passed. Then 90 minutes. She was about to violate his request for privacy when her phone finally buzzed. Can you come to the coffee shop? Daniel's text read, There's someone I want you to meet. Claire arrived to find Daniel sitting with a woman in her late 30s, pretty, tired-looking, with the bearing of someone who'd survived something that should have broken her. 2 kids sat with them, a girl about 12 and a boy about 10, both watching Daniel with expressions of cautious curiosity. Claire, this is Jessica Sullivan, and Emma and Jack. Daniel's voice was rough with emotion. Jessica, this is Claire Morgan. She's the one I told you about. Jessica stood, extending her hand. Thank you for what you're doing, the foundation. Daniel explained everything. I never imagined, her voice caught. Marcus would be so proud. They talked for 2 hours, the conversation flowing easier than it should have. Jessica told them about the years after Marcus's death, about moving to Oakland to be near her sister, about going back to school to become a nurse, about raising 2 kids who barely remembered their father but loved him anyway. Emma and Jack listened quietly, occasionally asking Daniel questions about their father. What was he like as a pilot? Was he scared during missions? Did he ever talk about them? Daniel answered each question with careful honesty, painting a picture of a man who'd been brave and funny and devoted to his family even when duty kept him away. Claire watched his face as he spoke, saw the grief there, but also something else. Release, maybe, or the beginning of it. Can I tell you something? Emma said suddenly, looking directly at Daniel. Mom showed us the news coverage from your landing. We watched it like 20 times. Emma's exaggerating, Jack interjected. It was more like 30. Emma elbowed her brother, then continued. The way you landed that plane, Mom said that's exactly how Dad would have done it. Calm and brave and making sure everyone was safe, even when you were probably scared. Daniel's eyes were bright with tears he was fighting to control. Your dad was braver than I'll ever be. Maybe, Jessica said quietly. But you're still here, still helping people. Marcus would call that brave too. Before they left, Jessica pulled Daniel aside. Claire couldn't hear their conversation, but she saw Jessica hug him, saw Daniel's shoulders shake slightly, saw her whisper something that made him nod. In the car afterward, Daniel was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, She forgave me. I told her I was sorry for coming home when Marcus didn't, and she said there was nothing to forgive, that Marcus made his choice and would make it again, that I was honoring his memory by still fighting for the things he believed in. She's right. Maybe. It's going to take me a while to believe that. He wiped his eyes. But Emma and Jack, they're good kids. Smart, strong. They asked if they could come to the foundation launch. Said they wanted to see what we built for their dad. And you said? I said yes, if that's okay with you. More than okay. They should be there. The foundation launch happened on a crisp September morning, the kind of perfect California day that made postcards jealous. They'd rented a modest community center in the Mission District, decorated it simply, invited key partners, and the first cohort of families the foundation would serve. Claire had expected maybe 50 people. 100 showed up. Military families who'd heard about the programs and wanted to learn more. Veterans struggling with transition who saw hope in the job training initiative. Pilots from across the country interested in the emergency response curriculum. Local press covering the story of the CEO and the pilot who'd survived a miracle and turned it into something lasting. Daniel stood at the front of the room, looking uncomfortable in the sport coat Claire had convinced him to wear. She'd offered to handle the speaking. Public presentations were her territory, not his. But he'd insisted on introducing the foundation himself. I'm not good at speeches, he started, his voice carrying just enough to reach the back of the room. And I'm not comfortable being called a hero. But I'm here because 7 years ago, I lost someone who mattered. Someone who made a choice that saved strangers and cost him everything. Marcus Sullivan was my wingman, my friend, and the best person I knew. Emma and Jack sat in the front row with their mother, listening intently. For 7 years, I've been running from what happened to Marcus, hiding in small towns and small jobs, convincing myself that not caring was the same as healing. Then 6 months ago, an airplane started falling out of the sky over Switzerland, and I had a choice. Keep hiding or step up. Run away or fly again. He paused, looking directly at Claire. Someone told me that maybe I was wrong about the part where I decided I didn't deserve to do anything important ever again. Turns out she was right. And this foundation, named for a man who gave everything to save people he'd never met, is proof that sometimes the things that break us can also build us into something better. The room was silent, every person locked onto his words. We can't bring Marcus back. Can't undo the losses that brought many of you here today. But we can honor those losses by supporting the families left behind, by training the next generation of pilots to handle the impossible, by building networks that catch people when the system lets them fall. That's what this foundation is for. That's why we're here. He stepped back, and the room erupted in applause. Claire saw Jessica wiping tears, saw Emma and Jack beaming with pride, saw dozens of faces reflecting the same hope she'd felt 6 months ago in a Swiss hotel lobby. She took the microphone next, outlining the specifics, program details, funding commitments, how families could access support. But the important part had already been said. Daniel had transformed their shared trauma into purpose, their survival into legacy. After the formal program ended, people clustered in small groups talking with program directors, sharing stories, making connections. Claire found herself standing with Jessica, watching Daniel crouch down to talk with Jack about something airplane-related. Thank you for giving him this, Jessica said quietly. Marcus always said Daniel was too hard on himself, that he needed someone to remind him he was allowed to be human. I think you're that person. I think he's been that person for me too, Claire admitted. I was drowning in success and didn't even know it. And now? Now I'm learning that the things that matter can't be measured in quarterly earnings or stock prices. She gestured at the room, at the families gathering information about support programs, at the veterans discussing job training opportunities. This matters. Maybe it's the first thing I've built that actually does. Jessica smiled. Marcus would have liked you. He always had a soft spot for people who figured out what was important before it was too late. The foundation grew faster than either of them anticipated. Within 6 months, they'd expanded to 7 states, served over 300 military families, and launched the pilot training program at 15 airports nationwide. The work was consuming, demanding, infinitely more complicated than Claire's corporate empire had ever been. It was also the most satisfying thing she'd ever done. Daniel moved to San Francisco permanently that winter, renting a small apartment in the Sunset District and officially joining the foundation as Director of Aviation Programs. He threw himself into the work with the same intensity he'd once applied to flying combat missions, developing curriculum, training instructors, personally mentoring pilots who showed up broken and left believing they could still contribute something meaningful. Claire watched him transform through the months, shedding layers of guilt and isolation like a snake shedding skin. He smiled more, laughed occasionally, stopped flinching every time someone called him a hero. They fell into an easy partnership, their different strengths complementing each other perfectly. Claire handled funding and logistics and the business side of running a major nonprofit. Daniel handled program development and the human connections that made everything work. Together they built something neither could have created alone. The romantic part happened so gradually that neither of them noticed until it was already there. Long working dinners that turned into longer conversations. Casual touches that lingered slightly too long. The way Daniel's first call when something went wrong was always to Claire. The way Claire's last thought before sleep was usually wondering if Daniel was okay. It was Emma, perceptive beyond her years, who finally called them on it. She'd started volunteering at the foundation on weekends, helping with administrative tasks and talking to younger kids who'd lost parents to military service. One Saturday afternoon, she cornered Claire in the break room. "Are you dating Daniel?" she asked with the bluntness of 12-year-olds everywhere. Claire nearly dropped her coffee. "What?" "No, we're colleagues. Friends. You look at him the way my mom used to look at my dad. In the old photos, I mean. Before he died. Emma, It's okay if you are. Jack and I talked about it. We think it would be good. Daniel's been happier since you hired him, and you're less scary than you used to be." "I was scary?" "Super scary. Like corporate ice queen scary. Now you're just regular person scary." Claire didn't know whether to laugh or be offended. She settled for honesty. "I care about Daniel very much, but it's complicated. We've both been through a lot. Neither of us is looking for—" She stopped, realizing she was explaining adult relationship dynamics to a child. "Why are we having this conversation?" "Because you guys are being dumb about it. Everyone can see you like each other. Just ask him out already." That conversation sat with Claire for 3 days before she finally worked up the courage to do something about it. She found Daniel in his office late one evening, reviewing applications for the next pilot training cohort. He looked tired but content, reading glasses perched on his nose, making notes in the margins of printed forms. "Got a minute?" she asked from the doorway. He looked up, smiling in the automatic way he'd developed around her. "For you, always." "What's up?" She closed the door and sat down across from him. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." The smile faded, concern taking its place. "That sounds serious." "It might be. Or it might be me overthinking something that doesn't need to be complicated." She took a breath. "Do you ever think about us as more than colleagues, more than friends?" Daniel set down his pen very carefully, his expression unreadable. "Why are you asking?" "Because a very wise 12-year-old told me I was being dumb about it, and because I've spent the last year working with you every day, and it's the happiest I've been in my entire life, and because when I imagine the future, you're always in it." "Claire, let me finish. I know this is complicated. I know we both have trauma and baggage and excellent reasons to not complicate what we've built here. But I also know that life is short and unpredictable. And I nearly died 6 months ago without ever telling anyone I cared about them. So I'm telling you now. I care about you, Daniel, not as a colleague, not as a friend, as someone I could see myself loving if you gave me the chance." The silence that followed felt eternal. Daniel stood up, moved to the window, looked out at the San Francisco skyline painted in fog and city lights. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. 7 years ago, I decided I didn't deserve happiness, that the cost of Marcus's death was that I spent the rest of my life alone, working penance for being the one who survived. Then you crashed into my life, literally, and started dismantling every wall I'd built. He turned to face her. "You terrify me, Claire. Not because you're cold or ruthless or any of the things you used to be, because you make me want things I thought I'd given up on. Partnership, purpose, maybe even love. And wanting those things means risking loss again. I know, but isn't that better than the alternative? Spending the rest of our lives safe and alone? Maybe. Probably. I don't know. He ran his hands through his hair, frustration and hope warring on his face. What if I mess this up? What if my trauma, or my nightmares, or my inability to be normal about anything important destroys what we've built? Then we'll deal with it, together. That's what partnerships are for. Daniel crossed the room in 3 strides, pulling her up from the chair and into his arms. The kiss was tentative at first, both of them testing this new territory, then deeper, as 7 months of restrained attraction finally found release. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Daniel rested his forehead against hers. I'm going to be terrible at this. Fair warning. Good thing I'm patient. Since when? Since I met someone worth being patient for. They took it slow, navigating the shift from colleagues to partners with the same care they'd applied to building the foundation. Some days were easy, dinner dates that felt natural, conversations that flowed like they'd been doing this for years, the comfortable intimacy of 2 people who genuinely liked each other. Some days were hard. Daniel's nightmares that woke them both, Claire's workaholic tendencies that made her forget to prioritize relationship over achievement, the moments when trauma caught up with both of them. But they worked through it, supported by the same community they'd built to support others. Jessica became a close friend, offering perspective from someone who'd navigated grief and new beginnings. Emma and Jack adopted Claire as unofficial aunt, teaching her about soccer games and homework drama and all the normal life things she'd missed while building her empire. The foundation continued to grow, but they kept it grounded in the principles Daniel had insisted on from the start. Direct service, minimal overhead, programs designed by people who understood need from the inside. By the 2nd anniversary of its founding, they'd served over 1,000 military families, trained 300 emergency response pilots, and created job placement programs that had helped hundreds of veterans find meaningful civilian work. The 3rd anniversary called for something bigger, a gala fundraiser to fund expansion into 10 more states. Claire hated the idea initially, remembering her corporate events with their false glamour and superficial networking, but Daniel convinced her it was necessary. These families need resources we don't have yet, he argued, and there are people with money who want to help but don't know how. We connect them to the need. Everyone benefits. The gala took place on a warm September evening, almost exactly 3 years after the emergency landing that had brought them together. They'd rented a space with views of the Golden Gate Bridge, decorated it with photos from the families they'd served, created displays showing the impact of every program. Claire wore an evening gown that cost more than her first year's rent, her concession to the formal nature of the event. Daniel wore a tux with visible discomfort, tugging at his collar and counting the minutes until he could escape. "Stop fidgeting," she whispered as guests began arriving. "You look handsome." "I look ridiculous. This is your world, not mine. Our world now. You're the co-founder. Act like it." The evening was everything Claire had hoped. Donors writing generous checks, military families sharing stories of how the foundation had helped them, press coverage that would extend their reach even further. But the highlight came near the end, when Jessica took the microphone for a surprise announcement. 3 years ago, I lost my husband to a mission that saved 23 lives. For years, I thought that was the end of the story. Marcus gone, our family broken, nothing left but grief and survival. Then Daniel Ross and Claire Morgan decided that Marcus's name should mean more than a flag and a medal. They built something lasting, something that honors not just my husband, but every service member who gave everything and every family left to pick up the pieces. She paused, composing herself. Tonight, I'm proud to announce that Emma and Jack Sullivan have been awarded full college scholarships through the Foundation's education program. My children will have opportunities their father didn't live to see them achieve, but his sacrifice is making it possible. That's not closure, but it's something better. It's legacy. It's proof that the best parts of the people we lose can keep growing long after they're gone. The room erupted in applause. Claire saw Daniel wiping his eyes, not bothering to hide his emotion anymore. She took his hand, squeezing tight. Later, after the guests had left and they were helping the caterers clean up, Daniel pulled her aside. They stood at the window looking out at the bridge lights reflecting on the dark water. "You know what's funny?" he said quietly. "What?" 3 years ago, I thought my life was over. Thought the best I could hope for was quiet obscurity, and maybe, if I was lucky, the nightmares would eventually stop. Then a plane started falling out of the sky, and everything changed. Best worst day of my life, Claire agreed. Mine too. He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. I've been thinking about something for a while now, wondering if maybe it's time to stop being so careful about the future. What do you mean? He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small box. Claire's heart stopped. I mean that you were right when you said life is short and unpredictable. I mean that I love you and I don't want to waste any more time pretending I'm not completely certain about that. I mean, he opened the box, revealing a simple ring that caught the bridge lights like captured stars. Will you marry me? Claire's vision blurred with tears. Yes, absolutely yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and they stood there in the empty event space, two broken people who'd found each other in free fall and built something beautiful from the wreckage. The wedding happened 6 months later, small ceremony on the beach, just family and close friends. Emma and Jack stood up with them, representing the connection between past and future, loss and hope. Jessica cried through the entire ceremony, but they were good tears, the kind that came from seeing healing happen in real time. Claire's vows focused on second chances and finding purpose in unexpected places. Daniel's focused on the courage it takes to love again after loss, to trust that happiness isn't betrayal of grief, but transformation of it. They honeymooned in Montana, Daniel's suggestion, wanting to show Claire the quiet life he'd left behind. Whitewood welcomed them with small-town warmth, the entire population of 4,200 seemingly determined to meet the woman who'd convinced their most famous resident to let himself be happy. Standing on the main street of that tiny town, looking at the mountains that had sheltered Daniel during his years of hiding, Claire understood what he'd been searching for here. Peace. Distance from expectations. Space to breathe without the weight of past failures crushing him. I get it now, she told him, wrapped in his arms as evening settled over the valley. Why you came here. Why it felt safe. It did feel safe, for a while. He kissed the top of her head. But safe isn't the same as alive. You taught me that. We taught each other. They returned to San Francisco and the foundation, diving back into work with renewed energy. The organization continued to expand, touching more lives every year, creating ripples that extended far beyond what either of them had imagined that first night in Switzerland. 5 years after the emergency landing, Daniel finally agreed to be interviewed about it, not by mainstream press but by a podcast focused on mental health and military service. He talked openly about Marcus's death, about the guilt that had consumed him, about the nightmares he still occasionally had. But he also talked about healing, about finding purpose in service, about learning that survival could be transformed into something meaningful if you were willing to do the work. Claire listened to the podcast from their home office, tears streaming down her face as Daniel shared parts of himself he'd guarded so carefully for so long. When he came home that evening, she held him without words, understanding that some things didn't need to be spoken to be profound. Emma graduated high school that spring, her college acceptance letters piling up from schools across the country. She chose Berkeley, close enough to stay connected to the foundation that bore her father's name, far enough to build her own identity. At her graduation party, she pulled Daniel aside. I wanted to thank you for everything you've done for me and Jack, for keeping Dad's memory alive in a way that matters. You don't need to thank me. Yeah, I do. And I wanted to tell you something Mom told me. She said Dad would be glad you found Claire, that he never wanted you to spend your life alone feeling guilty for surviving. He'd want you to be happy. Daniel's voice was rough when he answered. Your dad was a better person than I'll ever be. Maybe. But you're a pretty good person too. You just needed someone to convince you of that. That summer, the foundation launched its most ambitious program yet, a residential treatment center for veterans struggling with severe PTSD. It was Daniel's vision, born from his own experience with nightmares and guilt and the long road to healing. They bought land in Northern California, built facilities designed for therapeutic treatment and peer support, hired staff who understood trauma from lived experience. The center opened with 20 beds. Within a month, they had a waiting list of 200. Claire watched Daniel throw himself into this project with the same intensity he brought to everything that mattered. He spent days at the center, talking with veterans, sharing his own story, offering the kind of understanding that only came from having walked the same dark roads. "You're making a difference," she told him one evening when he came home exhausted and satisfied. "A real, measurable difference in people's lives." "We're making a difference," he corrected. "None of this happens without your resources and vision. And none of it matters without your understanding of what these people need. We're a good team. The best team." He pulled her close, and they stood in their kitchen, no longer her sterile palace of success, but their home, filled with photos of Emma and Jack, artwork from families they'd helped, evidence of a life built on connection instead of isolation. 10 years after the emergency landing, they hosted an anniversary celebration at the Foundation headquarters. The organization had grown beyond anything they'd imagined. 23 states, thousands of families served, hundreds of pilots trained, a residential center that had helped over 500 veterans find paths through their trauma. Gabrielle, the flight attendant who'd witnessed their near-death and sent that email years ago, flew in from Paris for the event. She'd kept in touch over the years, following the Foundation's growth with the pride of someone who'd seen it at its origin. "Do you ever think about that day?" she asked Claire during the reception. "The flight, the landing, how close we came to dying?" "All the time," Claire admitted, "but not with fear anymore. With gratitude. Everything good in my life traces back to that moment when I thought my life was over." Daniel said something similar. He told me that sometimes you have to fall before you can learn to fly differently. Emma and Jack were there, both in college now, but still deeply connected to the Foundation. Emma was studying social work, planning to join the organization after graduation. Jack was pre-med, talking about specializing in trauma counseling for combat veterans. Marcus's legacy, growing in directions he could never have imagined. Jessica had remarried, a kind man who loved her children and respected the memory of the husband who came before him. She looked happy in a way that had nothing to do with forgetting and everything to do with honoring the past while building toward the future. As the celebration wound down, Daniel found Claire on the balcony of their office, looking out at the city lights. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, and they stood in comfortable silence. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For not letting me stay invisible. For seeing something worth saving when I'd given up on myself. For building this with me." Claire turned in his arms, looking up at the man who'd saved her life, and then taught her how to actually live it. "Thank you for stepping forward that day, for taking control when everything was falling apart, for showing me that the most important things in life have nothing to do with quarterly earnings. We've come a long way from business class on that Geneva flight. Yeah, we really have." They kissed as the city hummed below them, two people who'd found each other in free fall and discovered that sometimes the things that break you open are the same things that let the light in. The Marcus Sullivan Foundation would continue to grow, helping more families, training more pilots, offering support to those who needed it most. But standing there on that balcony, wrapped in love and purpose and the quiet satisfaction of work that mattered, Claire and Daniel understood that the real miracle hadn't been the emergency landing. It had been everything that came after, the courage to build instead of hide, to love instead of retreat, to transform survival into legacy and crisis into calling. The sky had tested them both in different ways and at different times, but it had also given them to each other, had shown them that the altitude you climb from doesn't determine the height you can reach. Sometimes you have to fall 37,000 feet before you understand what it means to truly rise. And sometimes the person sitting beside you in business class, the one you dismiss as invisible and unworthy, turns out to be the one who saves your life in every possible way. Not just from a dying plane, but from a dying heart, a dying purpose, a life that looked successful from the outside but was hollow at its core. Claire had built an empire before Switzerland. After Switzerland, she'd built something better. A partnership, a purpose, a love story written in the language of second chances and hard-won redemption. The mountains had witnessed their near destruction. The city lights now witnessed their triumph, not over death, but over the fear that surviving wasn't enough, that broken people couldn't build beautiful things, that judgment made in arrogance couldn't be transformed through humility and grace, They'd been tested by fire and ice, by crisis and choice, by the terrible possibility of ending before truly beginning. They'd passed through it together and emerged changed, scarred but stronger, broken but healing, carrying loss but building toward light. And in the end, that was the only miracle that mattered. Not the landing, but the life they'd built from it. Not the survival, but what they'd chosen to do with their second chance. Not the falling, but the flying they'd learned to do together, with feet firmly on the ground and hearts finally, beautifully, courageously open to whatever came next.